The forest was on fire, and Alara Vance was running straight into it. Smoke rolled between the black trees in thick waves, stinging her eyes, filling her lungs until every breath felt like swallowing hot ash. Somewhere behind her, wolves were howling, but these were not friendly howls. These were the sounds of an attack, sharp and furious, cutting through the crackle of burning wood. She did not look back. She could not afford to look back. Her bare feet tore across roots and stone as she pushed deeper into the trees, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. A branch whipped across her cheek and she barely felt it. All she could think about was the small cabin she had left behind, the only home she had ever known, now swallowed by flames because someone had decided that tonight was the night to burn the edge of Silver Moon territory to the ground. She did not know why. She only knew that she had to survive it. A shape moved through the smoke ahead of her, low and fast, and she skidded to a stop, her breath catching. Golden eyes flashed in the darkness, catching the orange light of the fire behind her. A wolf, easily twice the size of a normal one, stepped out from between two burning trees, its fur the color of wet slate, its teeth bared in something between a warning and a promise. Alara's whole body went cold. She had grown up on the edges of the pack, always watching from a distance, never truly one of them, but she knew enough to recognize danger when it stood in front of her. She raised her hands, though she had no idea what she thought that would do against a wolf built like a small mountain. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm not your enemy." The wolf did not attack. It watched her, its head tilting slightly, as if it were listening to something she could not hear. And then, impossibly, heat bloomed in her chest, spreading down her arms and into her fingertips, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire around them. It was the same strange power that had flickered inside her since she was a child, the power she had spent her whole life burying, smothering, pretending did not exist, because every single time it surfaced, someone got hurt, or scared, or both. Tonight, she was too afraid to smother it. Light spilled from her hands, pale gold and trembling, and the wolf in front of her flinched back with a startled growl. For one terrifying moment, Alara thought she had made a mistake, that she had just given the creature a reason to tear her apart. Instead, the wolf turned and vanished into the smoke, leaving her alone in the burning clearing, with light still pouring from her skin, like something alive. She stared down at her own glowing hands, shaking, breathless, and utterly confused. "What are you?" she whispered to herself, though she already knew no one had ever been able to answer that question. Not the healer who raised her, not the pack elders who crossed the street when they saw her coming. Not even the fading memories of a mother she barely remembered, who had died before she was old enough to ask. The light faded as quickly as it came, leaving her standing in the dark, alone, surrounded by fire. She ran again, this time toward the sound of voices, toward anything that might mean safety. She broke through the last line of trees and stumbled into the wide clearing at the heart of the territory, where dozens of pack members had gathered, some fighting the flames with buckets of water and dirt, others standing guard with weapons raised against an enemy Alara could not see. And that was when she saw him. He stood near the center of the chaos, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair damp with sweat, a long tear in his shirt, revealing a shoulder still healing from a fresh wound. He was giving orders, in a voice that cut through the noise like a blade, and every single person around him moved the instant he spoke. There was no hesitation in the way they obeyed him. There was only respect, and something that looked a great deal like fear. Alara had never seen him before in her life, but she knew immediately that he was not from her pack. His presence alone told her that. He carried himself like someone who had never once in his life doubted his own authority. Then his eyes found her. Across the burning clearing, through the smoke and the chaos and the screaming, his gaze locked onto hers, and everything around him seemed to slow. His nostrils flared, his jaw tightened, and Alara watched, frozen, as something shifted in his expression. Something raw and possessive and entirely unfamiliar crossed his face, like a wave breaking against rock. He started walking toward her. "Alara!" A voice called out behind her, and she turned to see Mira, the healer who had raised her since she was small, rushing across the clearing with soot on her cheeks and terror in her eyes. Mira grabbed her by the shoulders, checking her over frantically. "You're alive. Thank the moon, you're alive." I thought. What's happening? Alara asked, gripping Mira's arms. Who attacked us? Who is that man? Mira's gaze flicked past her, and her expression changed instantly, tightening with something like caution. That, she said quietly, is King Draven Ashford, Alpha of the Northern Territories. He arrived 3 days ago asking for an alliance. I did not expect him to still be here when the attack came. An alliance against who? I don't know the details. Only the elders were told. Mira's grip on her tightened. Alara, listen to me. Whatever happens tonight, stay close to me. Do not wander off. Do not draw attention to yourself. It was too late for that. Draven was already there, closing the distance between them with long, purposeful strides, and up close, he was even more overwhelming than he had looked from across the clearing. He was taller than she expected, his shoulders wide enough to block out the firelight behind him, and his eyes, she realized now, were an unusual shade of amber, almost gold, exactly like the eyes of the wolf that had let her go in the forest. Her breath caught. It had been him, the wolf in the trees. It had been him the entire time. You, he said, his voice low and rough, carrying a note of disbelief. He stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and something about the way he looked at her made her feel like the only person left standing in the entire burning world. The light, that was you. It was not a question. I don't know what you're talking about, Alara said, though her voice shook and gave her away completely. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face, as though he were trying to memorize every detail of it, and then, without any warning at all, he reached out and gently but firmly closed his hand around her wrist. The moment his skin touched hers, something cracked open inside her chest, a sensation so intense it nearly knocked the breath out of her lungs. It felt like recognition. It felt like falling. It felt like every instinct she had ever ignored was suddenly screaming at once, and she did not understand a single part of it. Draven inhaled sharply, his eyes flashing gold for just a moment before settling back into their normal amber. Around them, several pack warriors had noticed the exchange and gone very still, watching with wide, uncertain eyes. Mine, he said, quiet at first, almost to himself, as though he could not quite believe the word, even as he said it. Excuse me? Alara tried to pull her wrist free, but his grip, though gentle, did not budge. His eyes darkened, and this time when he spoke, his voice carried across the clearing, loud enough for everyone to hear, deep enough to make the ground beneath her feet feel unsteady. You're mine. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the gathered pack members. Mira's hand flew to her mouth. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered the word mate, and the word landed on Alara like a physical blow. I don't even know you, Alara said, finding her voice at last, anger cutting through her shock. She yanked her wrist free, and this time he let her go, though his expression darkened further, as though her resistance offended something deep and instinctive in him. You cannot just grab a stranger during a crisis and declare that she belongs to you. It is not a declaration, he said evenly, though there was tension coiled beneath every word. It is a fact. Every wolf in this clearing felt it the moment I said it. You felt it too. I saw it in your face. She had felt something. She would not admit that to him. I don't care what you felt, Alara said, lifting her chin even as her pulse hammered wildly in her throat. I am not property to be claimed. Not by you, not by anyone. For a moment, something almost like respect flickered across his features, quickly buried beneath frustration. He was clearly a man unused to being refused, and it was equally clear that he had no intention of accepting her answer as final. Before he could respond, a warrior sprinted into the clearing, breathless, blood streaked across one arm. My king, he gasped. The attackers are retreating toward the eastern ridge. Shadowfen colors were spotted on their cloaks. Draven's entire body went rigid, his gaze snapping away from Alara for the first time since he had approached her. Shadowfen, he repeated, and the name came out of his mouth like a curse. Kale. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He dares to strike here, while I stand on Silvermoon soil. Who is Kale? Alara asked, though something about the tension gripping Draven's entire body told her she already did not want to know the answer. Draven turned back to her, and for just a moment, the fury in his expression softened into something almost like worry. The most dangerous man in the Northern Territories, he said, exiled from his own pack for reasons no one speaks of, now commanding an army of outcasts and rogues from the Shadowfen ruins. He has spent 5 years trying to destroy everything I have built. His gaze swept over her again, lingering, calculating. And now, apparently, he has chosen tonight to remind me that he still can. That has nothing to do with me, Elara said. It has everything to do with you, Draven said quietly, and something in his voice made the hair on her arms rise. Power like yours does not go unnoticed, Elara. Whatever you are, whatever that light was in the forest, Kael's spies will already be asking questions about the girl who lit up the trees like a second sun. And when they find out, he will not stop until he understands why. Alara's stomach twisted painfully. She had spent her entire life hiding her power out of fear that someone would see it and turn away in disgust. She had never once considered that someone might see it and want to use it. I need to get her somewhere safe, Mira said sharply, stepping between them at last, her voice trembling only slightly. My king, with respect, she has been through enough tonight. Draven's gaze lingered on Elara for one more long moment before he finally nodded, though the reluctance in the movement was obvious. She stays within the central longhouse, guarded. I will not have her wandering where Shadowfen eyes might find her. I do not need your protection, Elara snapped, though her voice wavered with exhaustion she could no longer hide. You do not have a choice, Draven said, and though his tone remained calm, there was something unshakable beneath it, something that told her arguing further would accomplish nothing tonight. Not until I understand what almost burned down half this territory, and why my wolf recognized you the second I saw you. He turned to issue orders to the warriors gathering around him, his voice once again sharp and commanding, every trace of the strange softness from a moment ago folded away behind the mask of a king preparing for war. Elara watched him go, her wrist still tingling from where he had touched her, her chest still aching with the strange, unwanted pull she could not explain. Mira guided her away from the chaos, toward the longhouse at the center of the territory, murmuring reassurances that neither of them quite believed. Behind them, the fires were slowly being contained, smoke curling up into a sky, just beginning to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn. Elara did not look back at Draven, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire way, a weight settling over her shoulders, like something that intended to stay. She did not know yet that somewhere beyond the burning tree line, on the far side of the eastern ridge, another set of eyes had also witnessed the light bursting from her hands, watching with far more interest than fear, calculating what a power like hers might be worth to a man with nothing left to lose. She did not know his name yet, but she would. The longhouse was quiet in a way that felt unnatural after the chaos outside. Thick wooden beams arched overhead, and lanterns hung from iron hooks, casting warm light over benches and long tables usually used for pack gatherings. Tonight, 2 guards stood at the door, their eyes alert, their postures rigid with tension that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with duty. Mira sat Elara down on a bench near the hearth and immediately began checking her for injuries, her hands quick and practiced despite the way they trembled. You're not burned, she murmured, more to herself than to Elara. No cuts, no broken bones, small mercies. I'm fine, Elara said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Her mind was still spinning, replaying the moment the light had spilled from her hands, the way the enormous gray wolf had frozen and then fled, the way Draven's eyes had flashed the exact same shade of gold. You are not fine, Mira said gently, sitting beside her. You watched your home burn tonight, and then a king put his hands on you and claimed you in front of half the territory. No one would be fine after that. Elara let out a shaky breath and pressed her palms against her eyes. What did he mean, Mira? About my light? About Kael's spies asking questions? Mira hesitated, and that hesitation told Elara everything she needed to know. There was something Mira had never told her, something buried carefully beneath years of silence. Your mother, Mira finally said, was not from this territory. She arrived here when she was already carrying you, alone, frightened, asking for nothing but shelter. She never spoke of where she came from, or why she left it. I only agreed to take you both in because I could see how afraid she was, and because turning away a mother and child felt like a cruelty I could not live with. You've told me this before, Alara said quietly. You've never told me why she was afraid. Mira's eyes glistened in the lantern light. Because sometimes, in the deep of night, I would hear her whispering to you when she thought no one was listening. Telling you to hide your gift, telling you that some powers were dangerous not because of what they could destroy, but because of what people would do to possess them. She reached over and took Alara's hand. I never understood what she meant, not truly. Not until tonight, when I saw the light pour from your skin, and watched a king who has never lowered his head to anyone look at you as though the entire world had shifted beneath his feet. Alara's chest tightened. I don't want any of this, she whispered. I never asked to be anything other than ordinary. I know, Mira said softly, but the world rarely listens to what we ask for. Outside, the sounds of the pack slowly settling into an uneasy calm drifted through the wooden walls, distant voices, the occasional bark of orders, the crackle of fires being smothered rather than fought. Alara stared into the hearth, watching flames she had learned to fear now flicker gently and harmlessly in front of her, and wondered how something as simple as fire could feel like an old enemy and a small comfort all at once. A knock sounded at the door, firm and unmistakable in its authority. The guard straightened before it even opened. Draven stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the doorframe, his shirt changed, the wound on his shoulder now cleaned and bound. Whatever fire had burned in his eyes during the attack had cooled into something quieter, though no less intense. His gaze found Alara instantly, as if some invisible thread connected them, and would not allow his attention to wander elsewhere for long. I need to speak with her, he said to Mira, his tone leaving little room for argument, though he added, almost as an afterthought, alone, if she permits it. Alara straightened at the unexpected courtesy. She had expected him to simply order Mira away, the way he had ordered his warriors earlier without a second thought. Instead, he was waiting, watching her, giving her the choice. She studied him for a long moment. You may stay, Mira, Alara said finally, testing the boundaries of the strange new power she seemed to hold over a man who commanded armies. Something flickered across Draven's face, frustration mixed with reluctant amusement, as though he had expected exactly this kind of resistance, and found himself unable to be truly angry about it. He crossed the room instead, and took a seat on the bench across from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to respect the space she had claimed. Tell me about the light, he said. I don't know what it is, Alara admitted. I've had it since I was a child. It comes when I'm afraid, or desperate, or in danger. I've spent my whole life trying to bury it because every time it appears, people look at me like I'm something to be afraid of. I wasn't afraid of it, Draven said quietly. You looked terrifying. I was not afraid of you, he clarified, his amber eyes steady on hers. I have never seen power like that in my life. Not from any wolf, not from any pack elder, not from any of the old stories the elders used to tell around the fire when I was young. It did not feel like wolf magic at all. Then what did it feel like? He was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. Older, he said finally, like something that existed before the packs did, before the first moon bond was ever formed. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. Alara, I need you to understand something important. Whatever that power is, Kale Nightshade will want it. He has spent years gathering anything that might give him an advantage against me. Anything rare, anything unexplained. If word spreads that a woman on Silver Moonland can summon light powerful enough to frighten a king's wolf, he will come looking for you himself. A cold shiver ran down her spine. So what am I supposed to do? Hide forever? No, Draven said, and something fierce settled into his expression, something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. You stay close to me. I will keep you safe, and in return, you will help me understand what you are, and why the bond between us formed the way it did tonight. I never agreed to any bond, Alara said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Draven's gaze softened, just slightly, the fierce king momentarily giving way to something almost vulnerable. I know this is not what you wanted for your life, he said. I did not walk into this territory expecting to find my mate either. But the bond does not ask permission, Alara. It simply is. The question now is only how we choose to move forward with it. Alara looked away, staring into the fire again, her thoughts a tangled storm of fear and confusion, and something else she refused to name, Mira watched the exchange in silence, her expression unreadable, though her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bench. "I need time," Elara said finally. "I just watched my home burn. I do not have the strength tonight to also decide the rest of my life." Draven studied her for a long moment, and then, to her surprise, he nodded. "Take the time you need," he said, rising to his feet. "But know that I do not intend to let you go, Elara Vance. Not to Kale, not to fear, not to anyone." He paused at the door, glancing back at her one final time, his amber eyes catching the lantern light. "You are mine, whether or not you are ready to accept it yet." He left without waiting for a response, the door closing softly behind him, and Elara sat in the quiet warmth of the longhouse with her healer beside her, and her heart pounding with something she could not name, staring at the fire, and wondering what exactly she had woken up inside herself, in the middle of a burning forest. Outside, far beyond the borders of Silver Moon territory, on a ridge overlooking the smoldering trees, a lone figure watched the distant glow of torches moving through the longhouse windows, his expression thoughtful, patient, and entirely too calm for a man who had just lost a battle. He had seen the light too, and he had absolutely no intention of forgetting it. Morning arrived pale and gray over Silver Moon territory, the sky still hazy with drifting smoke from the fires that had finally been contained some time before dawn. Elara had not slept. She sat by the small window of the guest chamber she had been given inside the longhouse, watching pack members move through the clearing below, clearing debris, comforting frightened children, counting the damage done to homes that had stood for generations before the attack. Her own home was gone. She had seen it happen with her own eyes, watched the flames swallow the little cabin where she had grown up, where Mira had taught her how to grind herbs and stitch wounds and pretend, for years at a time, that she was just another ordinary girl on the edge of an ordinary pack. Now there was nothing left of it but ash, and she had nowhere else to go. A knock came at her door, softer than she expected. When she opened it, she found not Draven, but a young woman, with warm brown skin, and sharp, curious eyes, dressed in the deep blue colors of the Northern Territories. "My name is Lyra," the woman said, offering a small, careful smile. "King Draven sent me. He thought you might want breakfast, and clean clothes, since yours were ruined in the fire." She held up a folded bundle of simple, practical garments. Elara accepted them cautiously. "Thank you," she said, though the words came out stiff with exhaustion and suspicion. "Are you his guard?" "His advisor," Lyra corrected, stepping inside as Elara waved her in. "Though I have handled enough emergencies during battles that I know my way around a sword as well." She glanced around the sparse room, her expression thoughtful. "I imagine last night was a great deal to take in." "That is one way to put it," Elara muttered, pulling the clean shirt over her soot-stained arms behind a modest screen in the corner of the room. "For what it's worth," Lyra said, her voice gentler now, "I have served King Draven for 6 years, since before he took the throne from his father. I have never once seen him behave the way he did last night. Never." She paused. "He is not a man who claims lightly, Elara. Whatever you think of him, know that the bond means something real to him, perhaps more than he knows how to express." "That does not make it any less overwhelming," Elara said, stepping out from behind the screen, dressed now in simple gray trousers and a soft green tunic that fit surprisingly well. "No," Lyra agreed. "I imagine it does not." They walked together through the longhouse, toward a smaller room, where a modest breakfast had been laid out, bread and fruit and warm tea. Simple, but welcome, after a night that had stripped away everything familiar. Elara ate quietly, aware of the low murmur of voices drifting from a nearby chamber where, she realized with a start, Draven was holding council with several of his warriors and a handful of Silver Moon elders. She could not make out every word, but she caught fragments. Territory boundaries, casualty counts. The name Kale, spoken more than once, always with tension coiled beneath it like a blade waiting to be drawn. "They will be discussing the alliance for hours," Lyra said, noticing where Elara's attention had drifted. "Would you like to walk instead?" "Fresh air might help more than sitting inside listening to politics," Elara agreed gratefully, and the two of them stepped outside into the cool morning, the scent of smoke still lingering faintly in the air, despite the cleanup efforts underway across the clearing. Pack members glanced her way as they passed, some with open curiosity, others with something closer to wariness. Word of what had happened the night before had clearly spread through the entire territory by now. "They're staring," Elara murmured. "They're curious," Lyra corrected. A claim like that does not happen often, and never in front of witnesses the way it happened last night. Some of them are probably wondering if the stories about fated mates are even true anymore, since so few claims happen these days without months of careful courting first. "He didn't court me at all," Elara said. "He just declared it in front of everyone like I didn't have a say." Lyra winced slightly, sympathetic. "That does sound like something he would do in the middle of chaos," she admitted. "Draven is not known for patience. He is known for decisiveness. Sometimes those two things look very similar, and are, in fact, very different." They continued walking toward the edge of the clearing, past the burned husk of what had once been a row of storage huts, when a commotion near the training grounds caught their attention. A group of younger pack warriors had gathered in a loose circle, watching two figures sparring with wooden practice blades, and at the center of it, moving with the same commanding presence he carried everywhere, was Draven. He had changed out of his formal clothes into simple training gear, his sleeves rolled up, sweat already gleaming on his forearms despite the cool morning air. He moved with brutal efficiency, disarming his sparring partner in 3 quick strikes before offering the man a hand up, the ghost of something that might have been respect passing between them. Then his gaze lifted, and found Elara across the training grounds, exactly the way it had found her across the burning clearing the night before, as though some invisible thread pulled his attention toward her no matter what else demanded it. He said something to the warrior beside him and crossed the field toward her, the practice blade still loose in his hand. "You should be resting," he said when he reached her, though his tone carried more concern than command. "I couldn't sleep," Elara said honestly. His jaw tightened slightly, as though the idea of her lying awake troubled him more than he wanted to admit. "The council session should conclude soon. Afterward, I would like you to join me. There are things we need to discuss, about your safety, and about what happens next." "What happens next?" Elara repeated, an edge creeping into her voice. "You mean whether I stay here, as your prisoner?" "As my guest," Draven corrected sharply, though he seemed to catch himself, softening his tone with visible effort. "You are not a prisoner, Elara. I understand that everything about last night felt as though your choices were taken from you, and I am sorry for that, but I will not apologize for wanting you protected, not when Kale's forces already know your face." Elara crossed her arms, unwilling to let the apology soften her entirely, though something in his voice, some genuine strain beneath the authority, made it harder to hold on to her anger than she wanted it to be. "I want answers," she said instead. "About the bond, about my power, about why your wolf recognized me before you even said a word to me. I am tired of everyone around me knowing more about my own life than I do." "That," Draven said quietly, "is fair." He glanced toward Lyra, who nodded and stepped back to give them a measure of privacy, though she did not go far. "Walk with me." They moved away from the training grounds, past the edge of the clearing, where the forest resumed, thick and green, despite the smoke damage closer to the settlement. Draven walked slower than Elara expected from a man who moved through every other part of his life with such forceful purpose, as though he were deliberately giving her space to match his pace, rather than demanding she keep up with his. "The mate bond," he began, "is not something either of us chose. It forms between two wolves whose instincts recognize something essential in each other, something beyond attraction or convenience. It is rare, rarer than most people realize, because so few pack members ever encounter their true match in a lifetime." He glanced sideways at her. "I did not expect to find mine on a diplomatic visit to a border territory." "And my power?" Elara pressed. "You said it felt older than wolf magic." "I believe," Draven said carefully, "that it is connected to your mother's bloodline, whatever that bloodline may be. There are old stories, mostly dismissed as legend now, about a lineage capable of a power tied not to any single pack, but to balance itself, a power that does not answer to strength or bloodline claims, but chooses on its own terms." He paused beneath the shade of a tall oak tree, turning to face her fully. "If that is true, Elara, then the bond between us may be more complicated than either of us understands yet. Your instincts recognized me last night, but your power, whatever it is, has not yet made its own choice." The words settled over her with unexpected weight. though she did not fully understand their meaning. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside her, a quiet unease stirred, the sense that something important was being left unsaid. "What happens if it chooses someone else?" she asked quietly. Draven's expression darkened, just slightly, the ghost of something possessive and afraid flickering across his features before he mastered it. "It won't," he said, his voice low and certain, though there was a tightness beneath the words that betrayed him. "You are mine, Ilara. Whatever your power decides, that will not change." She wanted to believe the certainty in his voice. Some small, traitorous part of her almost did. But far beyond the tree line, unseen and unheard, the wind carried the faint scent of smoke, and something else entirely, something patient and watching, and neither of them noticed the pair of dark eyes, observing the clearing from the shadows of the deep forest, studying the woman who had lit up the night sky, like something ancient finally waking up after a very long sleep. That evening, the council chamber filled once more, this time with Ilara seated near the back, at Draven's quiet insistence, close enough to hear everything, far enough to avoid being pulled directly into the arguments unfolding between the pack elders and the visiting warriors of the Northern Territories. An older woman named Celine, one of the eldest voices among the Silver Moon elders, rose from her seat first, her silver hair catching the lantern light. "We have lost 12 homes and nearly as many storehouses," she said, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her face. "If the Northern Territories wish an alliance, we require more than promises. We require protection, resources, and warriors stationed along our border, until the threat from Shadowfen is dealt with permanently." "You will have all three," Draven said without hesitation, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I do not make alliances I do not intend to honor, Elder Celine. Silver Moon's safety is now bound to my own." A murmur rippled through the room, at the implication behind his words, and several gazes flicked toward Ilara, who fought the urge to shrink lower in her seat. She was becoming increasingly aware that her presence here was no longer separate from the politics of the room, that whatever bond had formed between her and Draven the night before had quietly rewritten the terms of an alliance that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with her now. "And the girl?" another elder asked bluntly, an older man with a weathered face and sharp, assessing eyes. "Forgive my directness, my king, but the entire territory witnessed your claim last night. If she is truly your mate, what does that mean for Silver Moon's standing? Are we now bound to the Northern Territories through her, whether we wish it or not?" Draven's expression hardened, though his voice remained level. "Ilara's bond with me does not obligate Silver Moon to anything beyond the alliance already discussed. She is not a bargaining chip, and I will not have her treated as one, by Shadowfen or by anyone in this room." The elder inclined his head, accepting the rebuke without further argument, though his eyes lingered thoughtfully on Ilara for a moment longer before returning to the discussion. The council continued for another hour, voices rising and falling over maps spread across the long table, marking possible Shadowfen movements, discussing patrol routes, debating how many warriors could be spared from the Northern Territories without weakening Draven's own borders. Ilara listened, absorbing far more about pack politics in a single evening than she had learned in her entire life on the fringes of Silver Moon, and found herself, despite everything, quietly impressed by the careful, deliberate way Draven navigated each demand, never conceding more than necessary, never offering less than what was fair. By the time the council finally dispersed, night had fully settled over the territory, and Ilara felt the weight of the long day pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She rose to leave, only to find Draven falling into step beside her, matching her pace toward the guest chamber without a word of explanation. "You did not have to escort me," she said, though there was less bite in the words than she intended. "I wanted to," he said simply. They walked in silence for a while, the torches lining the longhouse corridors casting long, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Ilara found herself sneaking glances at him, at the tension still visible in his shoulders even after hours of difficult negotiation, at the quiet exhaustion he did not bother hiding once the council chamber doors had closed behind them. "You care about them," she said finally. "Silver Moon, you barely know this pack, and yet you fought for them last night, and you're fighting for them again now. A king who only protects his own borders is not much of a king," Draven said. "Besides, He glanced sideways at her, something softer flickering behind his amber eyes. Their safety matters to you. That alone would be reason enough. Ilara's chest tightened at the simple honesty in his voice, at the way he said it as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, requiring no further explanation. She did not know what to do with a man who claimed her in front of an entire pack one moment, and then quietly rearranged his priorities around her comfort the next. They reached her door, and for a moment, neither of them moved to end the conversation, the quiet stretching between them, charged with something neither of them named aloud. "Get some rest," Draven said finally, stepping back before the silence could grow into something neither of them was ready for. "Tomorrow will bring its own difficulties, and I would rather you face them with a clear mind." "Draven," Ilara said, stopping him before he could turn away. He looked back at her, waiting. "Thank you. For today. For not pushing harder than I could handle." Something shifted in his expression, warm and unguarded for just a moment, before the mask of the king settled back into place. "You do not need to thank me for treating you with respect," he said quietly. "That should never have been in question." He inclined his head slightly, a small, formal gesture that felt strangely intimate, given everything that had passed between them. "Good night, Ilara." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and Ilara stood alone outside her door for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar that she refused to examine too closely. Inside her chamber, she did not sleep easily. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the past 2 days, the fire, the wolf in the trees, the claim shouted across a burning clearing, the quiet, careful man who had walked beside her tonight, in complete silence, and somehow said more with that silence than most people managed with words. Somewhere far beyond Silvermoon's borders, in a territory built from shadow and ruin, a man with dark eyes and a patient smile sat before a low fire, listening to a scout describe the golden light that had erupted from the hands of an unknown woman during the previous night's attack. "Find out everything about her," Kale Nightshade said quietly, watching the flames dance. "Her name, her lineage, everything." He leaned back, a slow, thoughtful smile curving across his face. "If Draven Ashford believes he has found something precious, then I intend to see it for myself before he decides to keep it hidden away behind his walls." The scout bowed and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Kale alone with his thoughts and the crackling fire, already imagining the many different ways a woman with power like that might change the shape of everything he had spent 5 long years trying to build. 3 days passed in an uneasy rhythm of rebuilding and watching. Silvermoon's warriors patrolled the borders in tighter formations than before, Northern Territory soldiers stationed alongside them at regular intervals, and the damaged section of the settlement slowly began to rise again, plank by plank, beam by beam. Ilara spent her mornings helping Mira tend to the injured, her afternoons wandering the training grounds with Lyra, who had taken it upon herself to teach Ilara the basics of self-defense, insisting that a woman targeted by Shadowfen's interest should know how to protect herself with more than borrowed instinct. Draven she saw less than she expected, though never far enough that she stopped feeling the quiet pull of his attention whenever their paths crossed. He was constantly in motion, coordinating patrols, meeting with scouts, sending messages back to his own territory to arrange additional support. When their eyes did meet across the clearing, something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged aloud, an awareness that had settled into her bones despite every attempt to keep it at arm's length. It was on the 4th morning that everything changed again. Ilara had gone with a small group of pack members to gather herbs near the eastern edge of the territory, an area close enough to the border to require an escort, but far enough from the central settlement that it still felt like a small, welcome escape from the tension that had settled over everything since the attack. 2 young warriors, Finn and Garrick, walked ahead of the group, their postures relaxed despite the watchfulness in their eyes, while Ilara and 2 other women moved through the underbrush, filling woven baskets with the herbs Mira needed to restock her dwindling supplies. The attack came without warning. One moment, the forest was quiet, filled with birdsong and the soft rustle of wind through the leaves. The next, 3 rogue wolves burst from the tree line, their fur matted and wild, their eyes carrying none of the discipline of trained pack warriors, only hunger and violence. Finn shouted a warning, shifting instantly into his wolf form, but the rogues were fast, faster than anyone expected, and one of them barreled directly toward the herb gatherers before Garrick could intercept. Ilara froze for half a heartbeat, every instinct screaming at her to run, but one of the other women, an older gatherer named Ada, had stumbled and fallen, directly in the rogue wolf's path. There was no time to think, there was only time to act. Ilara threw herself forward, placing her body between Ada and the charging wolf, and the fear that exploded through her chest ignited the same power that had saved her during the fire. Except this time it did not simply flicker to life. It erupted, a burst of golden light so intense it lit up the surrounding trees like a second sun, tearing through the forest canopy. The rogue wolf yelped and skidded backward, momentarily blinded, and Ilara felt the power surge through her in a way she had never experienced before. No longer a defensive flicker but something vast and alive, coursing through her veins like liquid fire. She raised her hands instinctively, and the light responded, forming a shimmering barrier between herself, Ada, and the disoriented wolf. Finn and Garrick took advantage of the momentary chaos, driving the two remaining rogues back into the tree line with brutal efficiency. But the wolf in front of Ilara recovered quickly, snarling, lunging forward despite the strange light barring its path. Something inside Ilara reacted before her conscious mind could catch up. The light surged outward in a single powerful wave, striking the wolf and throwing it backward into a tree trunk, with enough force to leave it stunned and whimpering on the forest floor. The remaining rogues, sensing the shift in the fight, retreated into the deeper woods, leaving the clearing suddenly, eerily silent. Ilara stood frozen, her hands still glowing faintly, her chest heaving, staring down at the wolf she had thrown across the clearing, without ever laying a hand on it. "Ilara," Ada whispered from where she still sat on the ground, her voice trembling with equal parts gratitude and fear. "You saved my life." The light faded slowly from Ilara's hands, leaving her feeling suddenly hollow and exhausted, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Finn and Garrick approached cautiously, their eyes wide, their earlier confidence replaced by something far more uncertain as they looked at her. "We need to get back," Garrick said finally, his voice careful, almost formal, in a way it had not been before the attack. "The king needs to know about this." The walk back to the settlement felt longer than it should have, the silence between the group thick with things unspoken. Ilara caught the sidelong glances the others exchanged, the way Ada kept a careful, respectful distance despite her earlier gratitude, and she felt the familiar, painful weight of being seen as something other than ordinary settle back over her shoulders, exactly as it always had throughout her childhood. Word of the attack, and of what Ilara had done, spread through Silver Moon territory before they had even fully returned to the central clearing. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered, murmuring, watching, and Ilara felt every single gaze land on her like a physical weight. Draven emerged from the longhouse before she had even crossed halfway into the clearing, his expression carved from barely controlled fear, and the moment he reached her, his hands came up to grip her shoulders, checking her over with an intensity that left no doubt about how close he had come to panic. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "I'm fine," Ilara said, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. "Ada is fine. Everyone is fine." "I heard you threw a rogue wolf across the clearing without touching it," Draven said, his gaze searching hers, equal parts awe and alarm. "I don't know how I did it," Ilara admitted. "It just happened." Behind them, Elder Selene approached slowly, her expression unreadable, and several other elders followed close behind, their whispers carrying just far enough for Ilara to catch fragments. "Unnatural. Not one of us. Cursed, perhaps, or blessed, though who could say which." "She saved Ada's life," Finn said sharply, stepping forward, clearly having overheard the same whispers. "Whatever she is, she used it to protect one of our own." "No one is disputing her intentions," Elder Selene said carefully, though her eyes remained fixed on Ilara with an expression that was difficult to read. "But power like that does not simply appear from nowhere, child. It has a source. It has a history, and history, more often than not, comes with consequences we cannot always predict. Are you suggesting she is a danger to this pack?" Draven's voice dropped into something dangerously quiet, a warning coiled beneath every word. "I am suggesting," Selene said evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching, "that we would be foolish not to understand what we are dealing with, before Shadowfen decides to understand it first. That is not an accusation, my king. That is caution, and caution has kept this pack alive for generations. Draven's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, the tension in the clearing thick enough to feel like a physical presence. Alara stood in the middle of it, exhausted, shaken, and painfully aware that no matter how many lives her power might save, some part of the world would always look at her with suspicion first, and gratitude second, if gratitude came at all. "I need to rest," she said quietly, pulling free of the growing crowd, and Draven, after a long moment, nodded and guided her away from the gathering, his hand resting lightly against the small of her back, as though he could shield her from the whispers simply through proximity. Inside the longhouse, once they were finally alone, Draven turned to face her fully, his expression softer now that the immediate danger had passed, though worry still lingered heavy in his eyes. "You saved a woman's life today," he said. "Do not let their fear make you doubt that." "It's not just their fear," Alara said, sinking down onto a bench, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened since the fire, since the wolf in the trees, since the moment her entire life had tilted sideways and refused to right itself again. "It's mine too, Draven. I don't understand what I am. I don't know where this power comes from, or what it wants, or why it only shows itself when I'm afraid enough to lose control of everything else." She looked up at him, her eyes stinging with exhaustion and unshed tears. "How am I supposed to trust something I don't even understand?" Draven knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his amber eyes steady and unwavering. "Then we find out together," he said simply. "I do not have all the answers, Alara. But I promise you this, whatever your power is, whatever it becomes, I will not let it be the reason this pack, or anyone else, turns against you." She wanted to believe him completely. Some fragile, hopeful part of her almost did. But as she looked down at her own hands, still faintly warm from the power that had surged through them hours earlier, she could not shake the quiet, unsettling feeling that her power had plans of its own, plans that no promise, not even one made by a king, would be able to fully control. That night, sleep refused to come easily. Alara lay in the darkness of her chamber, staring at the wooden beams above her, listening to the distant sounds of the settlement, slowly quieting down for the night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the golden light bursting from her hands again, felt the strange, electric surge of power moving through her, like something alive and separate from herself, something that had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to wake fully. She thought about her mother, the woman Mira had described only in fragments, frightened and alone, whispering warnings in the dead of night about a gift too dangerous to reveal. Had her mother possessed the same power? Had she spent her life running from something, or someone, who wanted to claim it the way Draven now spoke of claiming Alara herself? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found Mira standing there, a small lantern in hand, her expression gentle but serious. "I couldn't sleep either," Mira admitted, stepping inside when Alara waved her in. "I keep thinking about your mother. About what she might have known, that she never told me." "Do you think she knew this would happen?" Alara asked, sitting back down on the edge of her bed. "That the power would grow like this?" Mira set the lantern down on the small table beside the bed, considering the question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that your mother spent every single day of the years I knew her, looking over her shoulder, as though she expected something, or someone, to come looking for you eventually. I always assumed it was fear, born from whatever trouble she had left behind. Now I wonder if she simply knew this day was coming, and dreaded it more than she ever let on." Alara wrapped her arms around herself, chilled despite the warmth of the small room. "I wish she were here to tell me herself." "So do I," Mira said softly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "But you are not without allies, Alara. Whatever your power is, whatever history it carries, you have people who care about you now. That has to count for something. Even the elders who look at me like I'm a threat waiting to happen?" Mira's expression tightened slightly. "Celine is cautious, not cruel," she said. "She has led this pack through droughts, through wars, through losses I would not wish on anyone. Her caution comes from experience, not malice. Give her time, and I believe she will come to see what I already do, what Draven already does. That you are not a danger. You are simply someone who has been carrying a burden alone for far too long." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, before Mira finally rose to leave, promising to check on her again in the morning. Alone once more, Elara found herself drifting toward the small window, staring out at the moonlit clearing below, the shadows of the rebuilt storehouses stretching long and dark across the packed earth. She did not see him at first, standing near the edge of the training grounds, alone, staring up at the same moon she watched. Draven had shed his formal responsibilities for the night, dressed simply, his posture less rigid than it appeared during council sessions or patrol briefings. There was something almost lonely about the way he stood there, a king without an audience, simply existing beneath the quiet sky. Without fully deciding to, Elara pulled a shawl around her shoulders and made her way outside. He heard her approach before she reached him, turning slightly, his expression softening the moment he recognized her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Neither could you, apparently," she said, coming to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the cool night air. "I have a great deal on my mind," he admitted. "Shadowfen, the Alliance, you." He glanced sideways at her. "Today, when I heard you had been attacked, before I knew you were safe, I have never in my life felt fear like that. Not during battle. Not during my father's final days, when the weight of the crown fell to me sooner than I was ready for it." He shook his head slightly, as though still processing the intensity of it. "I do not know how to explain it, except that some part of me has already decided you are essential to my life, even though we have known each other only a matter of days. That terrifies me," Elara admitted quietly, surprising herself with the honesty. "Not you, not exactly. But the idea that something in me already recognizes you the same way, before I've had any real chance to decide for myself whether I want this, whatever this is." Draven turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had not seen from him before, the mask of the king set aside entirely. "Then decide," he said simply. "Take whatever time you need. I will not pretend the bond does not exist, Elara, because that would be a lie, and I do not intend to lie to you. But I also will not force you to accept something you are not ready for. You deserve the chance to choose this, not simply have it happen to you." Something in his voice, the quiet sincerity beneath the usual authority, loosened a knot of tension in her chest that she had been carrying since the night of the fire. She looked up at him, at the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face, softening them into something almost gentle. And for the first time since this entire impossible situation had begun, she allowed herself to simply exist in the moment without fighting against it. "Tell me about your territory," she said instead, unwilling to fully answer the deeper question yet, but wanting, suddenly, to know more about the man standing beside her. "The Northern Territories. What is it like there?" A small, genuine smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him that carried no trace of political calculation. "Colder than here," he said. "Mountains instead of forests, mostly. My people are hardy, stubborn, fiercely loyal once you earn their trust. My father ruled for nearly 30 years before illness took him, and I inherited a territory still healing from old conflicts he never fully resolved." He looked out over the moonlit clearing, something reflective in his expression. "I have spent every day since trying to prove I am capable of finishing what he could not. Kale Nightshade is part of that unfinished business." "What happened between you and him?" Elara asked. "Really happened, not just the version everyone whispers about." Draven's jaw tightened, old pain flickering briefly across his features before he mastered it. "He was exiled for a crime he insists he did not commit," Draven said quietly. "A crime that, if I am honest with myself, I have never been entirely certain he was guilty of either. But the evidence at the time was damning enough, and my father's council demanded exile as the only acceptable punishment. Kale has spent every year since insisting the entire process was a betrayal, orchestrated by someone within the Northern Territories who wanted him removed." He paused, his expression darkening further. "I do not know if he is right. I have never been able to prove it either way. But his anger, whether justified or not, has cost countless lives on both sides since then." Elara studied him carefully, hearing something unexpected beneath his words. A thread of doubt he clearly did not allow himself to voice often. "Do you believe he could be telling the truth?" Draven was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I believe," he said finally, "that the truth stopped mattering to either of us a long time ago. We are simply two men who have spent 5 years trying to destroy what the other has built. Whatever justice existed at the beginning of this conflict has long since been buried beneath the weight of everything that followed. The admission hung heavy in the night air between them, and Alara found herself, unexpectedly, feeling a flicker of sympathy for a man she had never met, an enemy she had been warned to fear without ever hearing his side of anything. She did not yet know how much that small, quiet sympathy would come to matter. Draven walked her back to her chamber a short while later, the conversation settling into something easier, less charged with the tension of claims and bonds and unanswered questions, simply two people slowly, cautiously, learning the shape of each other. At her door, he lingered only a moment, before bidding her goodnight, and Alara closed the door behind her feeling, for the first time since the fire, something close to peace. She did not know that far beyond Silvermoon's borders, deep within the ruins of Shadowfen, a scout had already returned with a detailed report of the golden light that had erupted in the eastern forest, describing in careful detail the woman responsible, her name, her connection to the Silvermoon healer, and the unmistakable claim King Draven Ashford had made over her during the fire. Kale listened to every word in silence, his expression unreadable, and when the scout finished, he rose from his seat and walked to the narrow window of his ruined stronghold, staring out at the distant glow of Silvermoon's rebuilt settlement on the horizon. Alara Vance, he murmured to himself, testing the shape of the name, a power capable of frightening rogue wolves without a single blow landed. A slow, considering smile crossed his face. Draven, you clever fool. You have finally found something worth losing everything for. He turned back to the scout, his expression sharpening with sudden purpose. I want eyes on her at all times, but no contact yet. Watch. Learn her patterns, her habits, anything that might tell me what kind of person survives long enough to develop power like that. He paused, something almost thoughtful crossing his features. And find out everything you can about her mother. If this power runs in blood, I want to know exactly what bloodline we are dealing with, before Draven decides to bury the truth, the way his family has buried every other inconvenient secret over the years. The scout bowed and disappeared into the night, leaving Kale alone with the fire and his thoughts, already imagining the careful, patient game he intended to play, a game that would require more subtlety than force, more patience than the war he had waged against Draven for 5 long years. For the first time since his exile, Kale Nightshade found himself genuinely curious about someone other than the enemy, who had taken everything from him. He intended to make the most of that curiosity. 2 weeks passed, and slowly, cautiously, Silvermoon territory began to settle into a new kind of normal. The rebuilt storehouses stood sturdy against the autumn wind. Patrols moved along the borders with practiced efficiency, and the whispered fear that had followed Alara through the clearing after the rogue wolf attack had softened, though it had not entirely disappeared. Ada, the woman she had saved, had taken to greeting her warmly whenever their paths crossed, often bringing small gifts of preserved fruit or fresh bread as quiet thanks. And slowly, other pack members had begun to follow her example, treating Alara less like an unpredictable threat, and more like someone who simply happened to carry an unusual gift. Draven had kept his promise, careful never to push her faster than she wanted to move, though the pull between them had only grown stronger with each passing day, evident in the way his eyes softened whenever she entered a room, the way she found herself, more often than not, seeking him out simply for the comfort of his presence. It was during one of her increasingly frequent walks near the edge of the territory, a habit she had developed for the quiet solitude it offered, away from the watchful eyes of the settlement, that she first encountered the stranger. She had wandered farther than usual that afternoon, drawn by the golden light of late autumn filtering through the trees, her thoughts occupied with everything that had changed in her life over the past weeks. She did not notice him at first, sitting calmly on a fallen log near a small stream, as though he had been waiting there for quite some time. He was strikingly handsome in a way that felt different from Draven's commanding presence, leaner, quieter, with dark hair falling loosely across his forehead, and eyes so deep a brown they appeared almost black in the dappled light. He wore simple, unmarked clothing, nothing to indicate rank or territory, and when he looked up and noticed her, his expression carried none of the wariness she had come to expect from strangers who learned what she was capable of. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, his voice calm and pleasant, carrying none of the sharp authority she had grown accustomed to hearing from Draven and his warriors. "This stream is peaceful. I find myself drawn to it more often than I probably should admit. I haven't seen you in the settlement before, Elara said carefully, keeping a measured distance, though something about his manner put her strangely at ease despite her caution. I am not from Silver Moon, he admitted easily. I travel through these territories often enough, trading in herbs and rare goods. I find the northern borders quieter than most places, better suited to a man who prefers solitude to crowded halls full of politics. He gestured to the space beside him on the log, though he made no move to press the invitation further when she remained standing. My name is Kale. The name meant nothing to her in that moment. No warning bell ringing in her memory. Simply a stranger introducing himself in a quiet forest clearing. Elara, she said, offering nothing more. A beautiful name, he said, and something in the way he said it felt genuine rather than practiced, though she could not have said exactly why she believed that. You seem troubled, Elara. Forgive me if that is too forward an observation from a stranger. It has been a difficult few weeks, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. There was something disarming about him, an easy patience that made her feel, for reasons she could not fully articulate, that he was genuinely listening, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Sometimes, Kale said thoughtfully, the hardest burdens are the ones other people cannot see, the ones that live beneath the skin, rather than on the surface, where everyone can offer sympathy for something visible. His dark eyes studied her carefully, though there was nothing predatory in the attention, only quiet curiosity. Do you carry something like that, Elara? She should have been more careful. She would think, later, about how easily she had let her guard down, how the quiet peace of the forest and the gentle patience in his voice had made her forget every warning Draven had given her about strangers asking careful questions. Something like that, she admitted quietly. I find, Kale said, that people often fear what they do not understand, especially when that thing lives inside someone they cannot control. It is a rare and difficult thing, to carry a gift that others see as a threat, rather than a wonder. He said it simply, without pressing further, but the words landed with unexpected weight, precisely because they mirrored the quiet ache she had carried her entire life, without ever finding the right way to voice it herself. How would you know something like that? She asked. Kale's expression shifted, something old and weary, passing briefly across his features, before he masked it with a small, rueful smile. I have some experience being seen as more dangerous than I actually am, he said. It changes a person, being feared, before you have even had the chance to prove yourself one way or the other. They spoke for a while longer, the conversation drifting easily between small, harmless topics, the changing colors of the autumn leaves, the best places to find rare herbs along the northern trade routes, and Elara found herself, despite every instinct telling her to be cautious, genuinely enjoying the exchange. There was no weight of expectation in Kale's company, no sense that her every word was being measured against politics or alliances or bonds she had not chosen for herself. He simply spoke with her, as though she were an ordinary woman with an interesting life, rather than a claimed mate carrying a power that had upended an entire territory. When the sun began sinking lower behind the trees, she reluctantly rose to leave, aware that Mira and Lyra would soon begin worrying about her prolonged absence. I should return, she said. I did not realize how much time had passed. Of course, Kale said, rising as well, though he made no move to follow her. I hope we might speak again sometime, Elara. Conversations like this are rare enough that I would not want to waste the opportunity. Perhaps, she said, surprising herself with the genuine warmth in her voice. As she walked back toward the settlement, she found herself smiling faintly, the quiet weight that had settled over her since the fire feeling, for just a little while, slightly lighter. She did not mention the encounter to anyone once she returned, telling herself it was simply because there was nothing important to report, a chance meeting with a traveling trader, nothing more. She did not yet understand how carefully that first meeting had been arranged, how many days Kale had spent watching her patterns from a careful distance, before finally choosing the exact moment and location to make his presence known, calculating precisely how to appear harmless, how to seem like exactly the kind of quiet, understanding companion a woman overwhelmed by sudden fame and unwanted power might find herself drawn toward. Back within the ruins of Shadowfen, Kale returned to his stronghold well after dark, his expression thoughtful as he settled before the low fire in his private chamber. Well? Asked Renwick, his most trusted lieutenant, a scarred, broad-shouldered man who had followed Kale into exile 5 years earlier and had never once questioned his judgment since. Did the meeting go as planned? Better than planned, Kale admitted, a slow, satisfied smile crossing his face. She is exactly as the scouts described. Powerful, yes, but more than that, she is lonely, overwhelmed, surrounded by people who either fear her or claim her, and starved for the simple experience of being treated as ordinary. He leaned back, considering the fire thoughtfully. Draven has spent his life commanding people, Renwick. He does not know how to simply listen to someone. I intend to use that against him. You think you can turn her against him? Against her own claimed bond? I do not need to turn her against him, Kale said. I only need to give her a choice that Draven, in his certainty, forgot to offer her himself. A choice, freely made, rather than a claim shouted across a burning clearing. His dark eyes glittered in the firelight, something calculating and patient settling into his expression. Power like hers does not respond to force, Renwick. I have spent 5 years watching Draven try to force everything into submission, his enemies, his allies, and apparently now, even his own fated mate. If the ancient stories about her lineage hold any truth, her power will not simply bend to a claim. It will choose, and I intend to make certain that when it does, it remembers exactly who treated her like a person, rather than a prize to be won. Renwick studied his king for a long moment, a flicker of something like concern crossing his weathered features. And if you come to care for her beyond the strategy, my king, what then? Kale's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more contemplative, almost surprised by the question. Then, he said quietly, after a long pause, I suppose we will discover together exactly how complicated this game has become. Outside, the autumn wind picked up, rattling through the broken windows of the Shadowfen ruins, carrying with it the distant, mournful howl of a lone wolf somewhere in the darkness, an eerie echo of the storm that both men, in their own separate ways, had already begun quietly building toward. When Alara returned to the settlement that evening, she found Draven waiting near the edge of the clearing, his expression tightening with poorly concealed relief the moment he spotted her. You were gone longer than usual, he said, falling into step beside her as she made her way toward the longhouse. I was about to send Lyra to look for you. I lost track of time, Alara admitted, choosing her words carefully, aware of a strange reluctance to mention the stranger by the stream, though she could not have explained exactly why the impulse to keep the encounter private had settled so firmly in her chest. The forest was peaceful. I needed the quiet. Draven studied her for a moment longer than necessary, something perceptive flickering behind his amber eyes, though he did not press further. I understand the need for solitude, he said instead. Just be careful how far you wander. Kale's scouts have been spotted closer to our borders in recent days. The mention of the name sent an unexpected jolt through her, though she told herself it was simply the reminder of danger, nothing more. Do you think he would try something so close to the settlement? I do not know what Kale will or will not attempt, Draven admitted. That has always been the difficulty of facing him. He is patient in ways most warriors are not. He does not simply charge into a fight he cannot win. He waits, and watches, and strikes only when he has found the precise weakness he needs. He glanced sideways at her, something protective hardening his expression. Which is exactly why I would prefer you did not wander so far without an escort, Alara. Please. The please, softly spoken, unusual from a man so accustomed to commanding rather than requesting, softened whatever quiet defensiveness had begun rising in her chest. I'll be more careful, she said, and meant it, even as some small, curious part of her already found itself wondering whether she might encounter the quiet stranger by the stream again. That night, as she lay awake in her chamber, she found her thoughts drifting back to the conversation, to the easy, unburdened way Kale had spoken with her, so different from the careful, weighted exchanges she had grown accustomed to within the settlement, where every word seemed to carry the invisible pressure of politics, alliances, and the ever-present tension of the bond she had not yet decided how to feel about. She told herself it meant nothing, a pleasant conversation with a stranger, nothing more. She did not yet recognize the shape of the trap slowly closing around her, gentle and patient, built not from force or fear, but from the simple, seductive relief of being seen as ordinary, by someone who asked for nothing in return. Over the following days, she found herself returning to the same stretch of forest near the stream, more often than she consciously admitted to herself, and more often than not, she found Kale there waiting, always calm, always patient, never pressing for more than she offered freely. Their conversations deepened slowly, drifting from small, harmless topics into something more personal. Her childhood on the fringes of Silver Moon, her fear of her own power, the quiet ache of never quite belonging anywhere. Kale listened to all of it with the same careful, unhurried attention, offering thoughtful reflections rather than easy comfort, treating her fears as valid rather than something to be dismissed or managed. He never once mentioned Draven by name, never pressed her about the bond or the politics surrounding it, and that careful restraint, more than anything else, made him feel like a genuine refuge from everything overwhelming her life had become. She did not notice, not yet, how skillfully he steered every conversation, how carefully he shaped himself into precisely the kind of presence she needed most, patient, where Draven was intense, gentle where the world had grown loud and demanding, a mirror reflecting back exactly what she longed to see. Meanwhile, within the settlement, Draven's suspicions slowly began to sharpen, though he could not yet name the source of his unease. Ilara had grown quieter in recent days, her walks longer, her expression, when she returned from them, carrying a lightness he had not seen from her before, alongside a new carefulness in what she chose to share with him. He told himself it was simply the natural process of healing, of adjusting to a life turned upside down. He wanted, desperately, to believe that. But some old, instinctive part of him, the same part that had recognized her the moment he first saw her across a burning clearing, had already begun to sense that something important was shifting beneath the surface of her days, something he could not yet see clearly enough to name, though its shadow had already begun to fall across the fragile trust they had spent weeks carefully building between them. Autumn deepened across Silver Moon territory, the trees shifting from gold to a deep, burnished red, and with it, the rhythm of Ilara's days settled into a pattern she had not consciously chosen, but found herself unwilling to break. Mornings belonged to Mira and the healing hut, afternoons to Lyra's patient lessons in self-defense, and the hours just before sunset, more often than not, belonged to the quiet stretch of forest near the stream, where Kale waited with the same unhurried patience he had shown from their very first meeting. She told herself, each time, that this would be the last visit, that she needed to focus on the bond she had not yet fully accepted, on the alliance, and the danger, and the power still simmering unpredictably beneath her skin, and each time, when the appointed hour arrived, she found her feet carrying her toward the stream, regardless of every careful intention. "You look troubled again," Kale observed one afternoon, watching her settle onto the fallen log beside him, close enough now that the distance between them had become an old, familiar comfort, rather than a cautious boundary. "More than usual." "The elders held another council today," Ilara admitted, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. "They spent nearly 2 hours debating whether my power should be studied, documented, perhaps even tested under controlled conditions, as though I were some rare herb to be catalogued, rather than a person with feelings about the matter." "And what did you say?" "I wasn't invited to the discussion," she said, a flash of old, familiar frustration coloring her voice. "Apparently my presence made certain elders uncomfortable enough that Draven agreed to let them deliberate without me there, thinking it would spare me the discomfort of hearing myself discussed like an object." She shook her head. "I understand why he did it. I even understand why the elders are afraid, but it still felt like being erased from my own life." Kale's expression carried none of the practiced sympathy she might have expected from someone simply performing kindness. Instead, something sharper flickered behind his dark eyes, a genuine flash of anger on her behalf that surprised her every time she witnessed it. "You deserve a seat at every table where your own future is being decided," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "No one, however well-intentioned, has the right to speak for you, simply because they believe it spares you discomfort. That is not protection, Ilara. That is another form of control, gentler perhaps, but control all the same." The words settled over her with unexpected weight, articulating something she had felt but never quite found the language to express herself. "You make it sound so simple," she said. "But Draven has spent his entire life making decisions for entire territories. I don't think he even realizes when he's doing the same thing to me." "Perhaps not," Kale said carefully. Some men are so accustomed to command that they mistake protection for partnership, without ever noticing the difference. He paused, studying her with quiet consideration. Do you love him? The question landed unexpectedly, and Alara found herself hesitating, searching for an honest answer, rather than a convenient one. I don't know, she admitted finally. There's something between us, something I can't fully explain or deny. But love feels like a choice, and I'm not certain I've ever truly been given the chance to choose anything about this bond. It simply happened to me. The way the fire happened, the way this power happened. I've spent my whole life having things happen to me, rather than choosing them for myself. Kale was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something unexpectedly gentle. Then perhaps, he said, it is worth asking yourself what you would choose, if choice were genuinely available to you. Not what fate decided, not what duty demands, but what you, Alara Vance, actually want for your own life. No one had ever asked her that question so directly before, without an agenda tangled somewhere beneath the words. She looked at him, at the quiet steadiness in his dark eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite the overwhelming pull she felt toward Draven, but something equally real, a growing sense of safety, of being genuinely seen, rather than simply claimed. I don't know what I would choose, she admitted softly. I've never had the chance to find out. Then perhaps, Kale said, that is exactly what we should discover together, if you'll allow it. She should have recognized the danger in those words, the careful, patient seduction, wrapped inside genuine-sounding concern. Instead, she found herself nodding, something warm and hopeful blooming in her chest for the first time in weeks. Their meetings continued through the following days, growing longer, more comfortable, the careful distance between them slowly narrowing, without either of them fully acknowledging the shift. Kale told her small, careful pieces of his own life, an exile from a home he refused to name, years spent building something new from ruins others had abandoned, a loneliness that mirrored her own more closely than she had expected. He never lied to her outright, she would realize much later. He simply omitted, shaped, and curated every truth with careful precision, offering just enough honesty to earn her trust, without ever revealing the parts of himself that would shatter the careful illusion he had built. Meanwhile, back within the settlement, Draven's unease continued to sharpen into something closer to genuine alarm. He had noticed the pattern in her absences now, the way she returned each evening with a particular kind of quiet, thoughtful contentment that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, precisely because he could not identify its source. You've noticed it too, Lyra said one evening, finding him standing alone near the training grounds, his gaze fixed on the darkening tree line where Alara had disappeared hours earlier. Noticed what? Draven said, though the question carried no real denial in it. She's happier, Lyra said carefully, in a way that has nothing to do with anything happening here in the settlement. I don't think she's meeting with another pack member, my king. I think whatever is bringing her that peace exists somewhere out there, beyond our walls. Draven's jaw tightened, old instincts he did not fully trust rising sharply to the surface. Have the scouts reported anything unusual near the eastern stream? Nothing conclusive, Lyra admitted. Though Finn mentioned catching a brief scent near that area a few days ago, one he could not identify. He assumed it belonged to a trader passing through, given how close we are to the northern trade routes. The word trader settled uneasily in Draven's chest, though he could not have said exactly why. Have someone watch that area more closely, he said finally, discreetly. I will not have Alara feeling as though she is being surveilled, but I need to know she is safe. And if she is meeting someone? Lyra asked carefully. Someone she has chosen not to tell you about? Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening forest, something raw and uncertain flickering across his features before he mastered it back into the composed mask of a king. Then I need to understand why she felt she could not tell me, he said quietly, before I decide how afraid I should be of the answer. That night, when Alara returned from another lengthy absence, she found Draven waiting for her near the edge of the clearing, his posture carrying a tension she had not seen from him in weeks. You've been gone a long time again, he said, his voice carefully neutral, though something guarded had settled behind his eyes. I told you, I need the solitude, Alara said, the familiar defensiveness rising automatically, though this time it felt heavier, weighted with the growing awareness of exactly how much she had been keeping from him. Ilara. He said her name quietly, stepping closer, his amber eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten with guilt she did not fully understand. I am not trying to control you. I only want to understand what has changed. You seem different lately. Lighter, somehow, in a way that has nothing to do with anything happening within these walls. She wanted to tell him everything, in that moment, the quiet stranger by the stream, the easy conversations that had slowly become the brightest part of her days, the unexpected comfort of being asked what she wanted, rather than told what she needed. But something held her back, some instinct she could not fully name, a fear that speaking the truth aloud would shatter something fragile and precious before she had fully understood its shape for herself. I just needed space to think, she said instead, the half-truth settling uncomfortably in her chest. About everything. About us. About what I actually want, rather than what everyone around me assumes I should want. Draven studied her for a long moment, and she watched something complicated pass behind his eyes, hurt carefully buried beneath restraint, before he finally nodded, stepping back to give her the space she had asked for. Take whatever time you need, he said quietly, though the words carried none of their earlier warmth, edged instead with something that sounded almost like resignation. I meant what I told you weeks ago, Ilara. I will not force this bond upon you, but I would ask, if nothing else, that you trust me enough to tell me the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be. She watched him walk away, the distance between them feeling suddenly, painfully vast, and stood alone in the darkening clearing, with guilt settling heavy in her chest, unable yet to decide whether the secret she was protecting belonged to her own fragile need for autonomy, or to something far more dangerous that she had not yet allowed herself to fully recognize. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a patient man sat beside a quiet stream long after she had gone, watching the moon rise slowly over Silver Moon territory, satisfied with how carefully his plan continued to unfold, and entirely unprepared for the uncomfortable, unwelcome truth that had begun quietly taking root somewhere in his own chest. He had not expected to genuinely enjoy her company. He had not expected the warmth in her voice to feel like something worth protecting for its own sake, rather than simply a tool to be used against his oldest enemy. For the first time in 5 long years of careful, calculated strategy, Kale Nightshade found himself uncertain exactly which parts of himself belonged to the plan, and which parts belonged, unexpectedly and inconveniently, to something far more genuine than he had ever intended to allow. Days passed, and the strain between Ilara and Draven grew heavier with each one, a quiet distance settling into what had once felt like careful, patient closeness. They still spoke, still shared meals when duty allowed, still walked the settlement together during council breaks, but something essential had shifted, a wariness creeping into conversations that had once flowed easily between them. Ilara felt the weight of it constantly, guilt tangled uncomfortably with a stubborn, defensive conviction that she was entitled to some part of her life that belonged only to herself, some space that had not already been claimed, negotiated over, or folded into the politics of an alliance she had never asked to become central to. She told herself that her meetings with Kale were harmless, a simple friendship offering comfort during an overwhelming time, nothing more than that. She was not being entirely honest with herself, and some quiet, uneasy part of her recognized it, even as she continued making her way to the stream each afternoon regardless. You seem far away today, Kale observed one afternoon, watching her stare absently at the water, rather than meeting his eyes the way she usually did. Things have been difficult with Draven, she admitted, the words slipping out, before she could carefully consider whether she wanted to share them. He knows something has changed. I don't think he knows what, exactly, but he's noticed the distance, and I don't know how to explain it without hurting him. Why does the explanation need to hurt him? Kale asked carefully. You are allowed to have a life beyond the bond, Ilara. Friendship is not a betrayal. Isn't it? She asked, finally meeting his gaze. I haven't told him about you, not because there's anything wrong with our conversations, but because some part of me knows that if I did, he would want it to stop, and some other part of me isn't ready to let it stop. She shook her head slowly. That feels like more than simple friendship, even if I can't fully explain what it actually is. Kale was quiet for a long moment, something conflicted passing behind his dark eyes before he spoke again. his voice softer than she had heard it before. "I will not pretend I have been entirely honest with you, Ilara," he said slowly, and something in his tone made her chest tighten with sudden apprehension. "There are things about myself I have not yet shared." Her heart began to pound. What things? He hesitated, visibly weighing something internally, and for a moment, she thought he might finally tell her the truth, might finally reveal the name that would shatter every careful assumption she had built about their quiet, comfortable friendship. But something held him back, some final, calculated restraint, or perhaps something more complicated than calculation entirely, and the moment passed. "Simply that I have not always lived a peaceful life," he said instead, the confession vague enough to feel honest without revealing anything essential. "I have made enemies. I have lost people I cared about. I understand, better than most, what it feels like to be defined entirely by other people's fear, rather than your own choices." He looked at her steadily. "I did not want that history to color how you saw me, at least not until you had come to know me for myself first." It was not a lie, exactly, though it was far from the whole truth, and Ilara, desperate for the comfort his friendship offered, chose to accept the partial honesty, rather than push for more. "Thank you for telling me even that much," she said quietly. Meanwhile, within the settlement, Draven had reached the limits of his patience. 3 more days of watching Ilara disappear into the forest, 3 more evenings of returning to find her guarded and distant, had finally driven him to a decision he had resisted making, out of respect for the space she had asked for. "Tomorrow," he told Lyra quietly, standing once again at the edge of the training grounds as dusk settled over the clearing, "I intend to follow her." "You said you would not surveil her," Lyra reminded him gently, though there was no real argument in her tone, only careful caution. "I am not trying to control her," Draven said, frustration and fear tangled together beneath the words. "I am trying to protect her, Lyra. Kale scouts have been sighted near our borders 3 separate times this month. If there is even the smallest possibility that whatever is drawing her into the forest each day is connected to him, I cannot simply stand aside and hope for the best out of respect for her privacy." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "I would rather she be angry with me for a broken promise than lost to something I failed to prevent because I was too afraid of overstepping." Lyra studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then I will accompany you," she said. "If nothing else, a second set of eyes will help ensure we are not simply chasing shadows." The following afternoon, as Ilara made her familiar way toward the eastern stream, she did not notice the 2 careful, silent figures following at a discreet distance, moving through the underbrush with practiced stealth, staying just far enough back to avoid detection, while keeping her firmly within sight. She reached the fallen log by the stream and settled into her usual spot, waiting, and within minutes, Kale emerged from the tree line on the opposite bank, his expression warming the moment he saw her, the easy familiarity between them evident in every line of his posture. Draven, crouched low in the underbrush a considerable distance away, felt his entire body go rigid the moment he laid eyes on the stranger, some deep, primal instinct recognizing the shape of danger even before his conscious mind could fully process what he was seeing. Beside him, Lyra inhaled sharply, her hand tightening around the hilt of her blade. "My king," she whispered, her voice barely audible, though the tension in it carried clearly enough. "I do not know that man's face, but something about him feels wrong. Familiar, somehow, though I cannot place why." Draven said nothing, his gaze fixed on the easy, comfortable way Ilara leaned toward the stranger, the warmth in her expression that he had not seen directed toward himself in days, and felt something cold and furious settle into his chest, a jealousy so raw it startled him with its intensity. He did not yet know the stranger's name. He did not yet understand the full scope of what he was witnessing. But he understood, with sudden, devastating clarity, exactly why Ilara had kept this secret buried so carefully. And the understanding cut far deeper than he had prepared himself for, settling into his chest like a wound that would take considerably longer to heal than the physical scars he had carried home from every battle he had ever survived. Draven did not confront her that evening. He waited, forcing himself through the motions of council meetings and patrol reports, with a composure that cost him more than he cared to admit, until Ilara had returned safely to the settlement, and the household had settled into its usual quiet rhythm for the night. Only then, Once he had given himself time enough to master the storm of fury and hurt still churning beneath his ribs, did he seek her out. He found her in the small garden behind the longhouse, tending to a handful of late-season herbs by lantern light, her expression calm, in a way that made the anger in his chest burn hotter, precisely because he understood now exactly where that calm had come from. "Alara," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension coiled beneath every syllable. "We need to talk." She looked up, something in his tone immediately putting her on alert. "What's wrong?" "I followed you today," he said, deciding there was no gentle way to begin the conversation, no path forward that did not require confronting the truth directly, to the eastern stream. The color drained from her face, guilt and fear flashing across her features in quick succession. "Draven." "Who is he?" Draven demanded, the careful control finally cracking, raw hurt bleeding through every word. "Weeks, Alara. You have been meeting with a stranger for weeks, and you never once thought to tell me, even as I stood beside you worrying that Kale's forces were closing in on our borders." "It isn't what you think," Alara said, rising quickly, her heart pounding with a mixture of shame and defensiveness. "He's just someone I talk to, a trader passing through the territories. He listens to me, Draven, without trying to manage every aspect of my life, the way everyone else seems determined to do." "A traitor," Draven repeated, something dark and skeptical settling into his expression. "Did he give you a name?" "Kale," Alara said, and the moment the word left her mouth, she watched Draven's entire body go rigid, the color draining from his face, as something far worse than simple jealousy settled into his features. "Kale?" Draven repeated, his voice suddenly deathly quiet, more frightening in its stillness than any shout could have been. Dark hair, brown eyes, a calm, careful way of speaking, as though every word has been considered 3 times before it leaves his mouth. Alara's stomach dropped. "How do you know what he looks like?" "Because I have spent 5 years fighting a war against him," Draven said, each word landing like a blow. "Because the man you have been meeting in secret for weeks, the man you have trusted with things you have not even shared with me, is Kale Nightshade, the exiled alpha of Shadowfen, the enemy who tried to burn Silver Moon to the ground, the very night I claimed you as my mate." The words hit her like a physical blow, the ground seeming to tilt beneath her feet, as every gentle conversation, every quiet moment of connection by the stream, rearranged itself instantly into something far darker and more calculated than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. He never once tried to hurt me. He never asked me to do anything, never pressed me about you, about the bond, about anything that would suggest." "Of course he didn't," Draven said, bitter fury threading through every word. "He is patient, Alara. He does not rush his strategies. He builds them slowly, carefully, until his target has no idea they have been maneuvered exactly where he wants them, until the trap has already closed around them completely." He stepped closer, his amber eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and devastating hurt. "He has spent 5 years trying to destroy everything I have built. Do you truly believe it is a coincidence that the very moment I claim my mate, a man who has hunted me for years, suddenly appears in your life, careful and charming, and offering you exactly the freedom you have been craving?" Alara's mind reeled, memories of every conversation replaying themselves with horrifying new context. The careful way Kale had never mentioned Draven by name until she brought him up herself. The vague, incomplete confession about enemies and lost people that had felt honest at the time, but now read as something far more calculated. She had been so desperate for someone who simply listened without demanding anything in return that she had never once questioned why a stranger would offer such patient, unconditional attention to a woman he had only just met. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "Draven, I swear to you, I had no idea who he was." "I believe you," Draven said, and something in the way he said it, quiet and exhausted rather than accusatory, hurt worse than continued anger would have. "That is precisely what makes it so dangerous, Alara. He did not need you to know. He only needed you to trust him enough, to keep meeting him in secret, to keep information about our territory, our defenses, our alliance, flowing to him through careful, harmless-sounding conversation. All while you believed you were simply enjoying a friendship you had earned entirely on your own." I never told him anything about our defenses, Elara said, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself desperately trying to remember every detail of every conversation, searching for anything she might have inadvertently shared. Perhaps not directly, Draven said. But he did not need battle plans from you, Elara. He needed something far more valuable. He needed to understand you, your fears, your loneliness, the exact shape of the wound he could exploit to pull you away from everything I have tried to build with you. His voice cracked slightly on the final words, the fury finally giving way to something rawer and more painful underneath. And it worked. The accusation, however gently delivered, landed like a physical wound. Elara felt tears burning behind her eyes, shame and fury, and devastating confusion tangling together until she could barely think clearly. I never chose him over you, she said. I never even had the chance to know I was choosing anything at all. Didn't you? Draven asked quietly. You chose to keep meeting him, Elara. Every single day for weeks. You chose silence over honesty, comfort over trust. I do not blame you for wanting something that felt easier than the weight of everything happening between us, but that choice still had consequences, whether you understood the danger behind it or not. Elara had no answer for that, because some small, honest part of her recognized the truth in it, however painful. She had known, on some level, that the secrecy itself was a choice, even if she had not understood the full danger hidden behind the man she had been protecting that secrecy for. What happens now? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring at her, with an expression that mixed devastation and exhaustion, and something that looked, painfully, like the beginning of resignation. Now, he said, I need to decide how to protect this territory, and you, from a man who has clearly proven he can reach you even inside walls I believed were secure. And you need to decide, once and for all, exactly what you want, Elara. Because I cannot keep fighting for a bond you have not yet chosen to fully accept, not while the man trying to destroy everything I have built is quietly working his way into the parts of your heart I have not yet earned. He turned and left before she could respond, his footsteps heavy and final against the packed earth of the garden path, and Elara sank down onto the small wooden bench beside her abandoned herbs, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, overwhelmed by guilt and confusion, and a grief she had not expected to feel so sharply over a friendship she had never fully understood as anything more dangerous than comfort. She did not yet know that far beyond the settlement walls, the very power she had spent her entire life trying to suppress had already, quietly, irrevocably, begun making a choice of its own, one that neither claim nor careful strategy would ultimately be able to fully control. Mira found her there nearly an hour later, still sitting in the darkened garden, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying, the abandoned herbs wilting slightly in the cool night air beside her. She said nothing at first, simply settling onto the bench and pulling Elara into a careful, steadying embrace, letting the silence stretch until Elara found the strength to speak. I ruined everything, Elara finally whispered against Mira's shoulder. I let myself be fooled by the one man who has spent years trying to destroy the person who claimed me, and I don't even know if I can forgive myself for how easily he got past every guard I thought I had. You are not the first person to be deceived by someone skilled at deception, Mira said gently, pulling back to look at her carefully. That is not a weakness, Elara. That is simply what happens when a patient, calculating man decides to target someone's loneliest, most vulnerable places. It says far more about his cruelty than it does about any failing on your part. Draven doesn't see it that way, Elara said miserably. Not entirely. He said I chose the silence, chose the secrecy, even if I didn't understand the danger behind it. He is hurt, Mira said carefully. Hurt people do not always speak with perfect fairness, even when their underlying point carries some truth. Give him time to process this, the same way you need time to process it yourself. She squeezed Elara's hand gently. But do not let his hurt convince you that you are entirely to blame for another man's calculated cruelty. There is a difference between the two, even if it does not feel that way tonight. Elara nodded slowly, though the guilt sat heavy and unmoving in her chest, regardless of Mira's careful reassurance. What do I do now? You give him space to work through his anger, Mira said, and you spend some time asking yourself honestly what you actually want, separate from guilt, separate from fear, separate from anyone else's expectations. That question deserves an honest answer, Alara, whatever that answer turns out to be. Meanwhile, within his private council chamber, Draven sat alone, long after the rest of the settlement had gone quiet for the night. A single lantern casting flickering shadows across the map spread before him, marking every known Shadowfen position along the northern border. His hands were steady as he traced the familiar lines of territory, but his mind remained anywhere but strategy, circling instead around the image of Alara's face when she had spoken Kale's name, the genuine shock and horror in her expression that told him, more clearly than any words could have, that she truly had not known. That knowledge should have offered some comfort. Instead, it only deepened the ache settling into his chest, because it meant Kale's strategy had been even more precise and devastating than he initially feared, patient enough to build genuine trust, rather than simply manufacturing a lie easily dismantled once discovered. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Lyra entered without waiting for a response, her expression carefully neutral despite the concern evident beneath it. "You should rest, my king," she said. "There is nothing more to be gained from staring at those maps tonight." "I keep asking myself how I missed it," Draven said quietly, not looking up from the maps. "Weeks, Lyra. He spent weeks reaching her, right beneath our watch, and I was so consumed with council meetings and border patrols that I nearly missed it entirely." "You did not miss it," Lyra reminded him gently. "You noticed the change in her almost immediately. You simply gave her the respect of space, rather than immediately assuming the worst. Because that is who you are, even when it costs you." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "Do not let this make you doubt every instinct that makes you a fair and thoughtful leader, my king. Kale's cruelty is not a reflection of your failure. It is simply a reflection of how far he is willing to go to win a war he has already lost on every honorable front." Draven exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at her words, though the ache in his chest remained stubbornly unmoved. "What do we do now?" "We strengthen the border patrols immediately," Lyra said, "and we consider carefully whether Kale's interest in Alara extends beyond simple strategy. If he has spent weeks building a genuine connection with her, my king, his motivations may prove more complicated, and therefore more dangerous, than we initially assumed." Draven's jaw tightened at the implication, jealousy and fear tangling uncomfortably together in his chest. "You think he could actually care for her, genuinely?" "I think," Lyra said carefully, "that even calculating men are not always immune to the very connections they set out to manufacture. It would not be the first time a careful plan became complicated by an inconvenient truth." She studied him for a long moment. "Whatever the case, my king, the more pressing concern remains the same. Alara's power is unlike anything either territory has encountered before, and if Kale's interest in her runs deeper than strategy, the coming conflict may prove far more unpredictable than a simple battle over borders." Draven said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the maps without truly seeing them, his mind instead replaying every quiet, careful moment he had shared with Alara over the past weeks, the walks beneath the moonlight, the halting honesty about his father's failures and his own fears of inadequacy, the fragile, growing trust he had believed they were carefully building together. He did not know, not yet, exactly how that trust might be rebuilt, or whether it could be rebuilt at all in the face of everything that had just been revealed. But he understood, with the same certainty that had recognized her the moment he first saw her across a burning clearing, that he was not yet ready to let her go, regardless of how complicated, or how dangerous, the path forward had suddenly become. Somewhere beyond the settlement walls, unaware that his secret had already been exposed, Kale sat before his own quiet fire, turning over the events of the day's conversation in his mind, troubled by a realization he had not expected to face, a genuine, unwelcome fondness that had begun quietly reshaping the careful, calculated strategy he had spent weeks constructing so patiently. He did not yet know that the game he had been so carefully controlling had already, without his awareness, begun slipping beyond his ability to fully manage, both because of the truth Draven had already uncovered, and because of the far more dangerous truth quietly stirring within his own increasingly conflicted heart. 3 days passed in a tense, careful silence between Alara and Draven, both of them moving through the settlement with the practiced politeness of two people, determined not to let their unresolved pain spill over into the watchful eyes of the pack. Alara had not returned to the eastern stream, and though no one had explicitly forbidden it, the unspoken understanding hung heavy between them regardless. It was on the fourth night, well past midnight, that the true danger finally revealed itself, though not from the direction anyone had been watching. Alara woke to the sound of screaming. She bolted upright in her bed, disoriented for a moment, before the acrid smell of smoke reached her, thinner and sharper than the fire weeks earlier, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable clash of steel against steel, somewhere beyond her chamber walls. She threw on the nearest clothing she could find and rushed into the corridor, where chaos had already fully taken hold, pack warriors sprinting past her toward the main entrance, shouting orders she could barely process through the pounding fear in her ears. "What's happening?" She grabbed the arm of a passing warrior, a young man she recognized vaguely from the training grounds. "Attack," he gasped, barely slowing his pace. "Not Shadowfen colors, though. Something else. We don't know who they are." The warning sent a fresh wave of terror through her chest. If not Shadowfen, then who? She pushed forward toward the main clearing despite every instinct screaming at her to find shelter, driven by an urgent need to understand exactly what threat had descended upon the settlement in the dead of night. The scene that greeted her outside was chaos incarnate, fires burning in scattered pockets across the clearing, warriors locked in brutal combat, with attackers dressed in unfamiliar black and crimson colors, their movements coordinated with a discipline that suggested far more organization than a simple rogue raid. Draven stood near the center of it, directing his warriors with sharp, urgent commands, blood already streaking one side of his face from a wound she could not tell the severity of from this distance. "Alara, get back inside." Lyra's voice cut through the chaos as she appeared beside her, sword drawn, her expression fierce with battle focus. "This is not safe. You need to." The warning died in Lyra's throat as three attackers broke away from the main fighting and turned directly toward Alara, their movements purposeful, in a way that made it immediately, terrifyingly clear, that she was not simply caught in the crossfire of a random attack. They were here for her. Lyra moved to intercept, but there were too many, and Alara watched in horror as one of the attackers slipped past her, closing the distance with frightening speed, a curved blade catching the firelight as it swung toward her. Fear exploded through her chest, and with it, the power she had spent weeks trying to understand and control finally erupted with an intensity she had never experienced before, not even during the rogue wolf attack near the eastern stream. Golden light burst from her entire body this time, not simply her hands, radiating outward in a shimmering wave that sent the attacker flying backward through the air, crashing hard into the ground several feet away. But the light did not stop there. It kept building, spiraling upward around her in a column of brilliant, blinding gold, and Alara felt herself losing control of it entirely, the power moving through her, like a living current, with intentions entirely separate from her own conscious will. "Alara." Draven's voice cut through the chaos, and she caught a glimpse of him fighting his way toward her, desperation etched across every line of his face, but the distance felt impossibly vast, the battle between them, a churning storm of steel and fire, that no amount of urgency could cross quickly enough. The power surged again, and this time, it did something entirely unexpected. Instead of simply defending her, the golden light began pulling outward, reaching, searching, as though seeking something specific within the chaos of the battlefield, something it needed to find before it could settle back into stillness. Alara felt it happen before she understood what it meant. A sudden, overwhelming pull deep in her chest. The same electric recognition she had felt the night Draven first touched her wrist during the fire, except this time, it was reaching toward someone else entirely, someone who had just burst through the tree line at the edge of the clearing, his expression carrying the same shocked recognition, now blooming across her own face. Kale. He had come, drawn by the chaos, or perhaps by some instinct of his own that he would later struggle to fully explain, and the moment his eyes met hers across the burning clearing, the golden light surrounding Alara surged violently outward, crossing the distance between them like a living thing, wrapping around them both in a brilliant, blinding pulse that brought the entire battle to a sudden, stunned halt. Every wolf on the battlefield, friend and enemy alike, froze at the sensation, an unmistakable, ancient recognition rippling through the air, ancient enough and deep enough that even those with no understanding of Alara's lineage felt its significance in their bones. The bond formed in an instant, searing and undeniable, and Alara gasped as the sensation crashed through her, Not the gentler pull she had felt with Draven, but something vast and consuming, a recognition that reached all the way down to whatever ancient power ran through her blood, choosing, with absolute certainty, the man standing across the clearing, rather than the one who had claimed her weeks earlier, beneath a different burning sky. No, Draven's voice broke through the sudden, stunned silence, raw and devastated, as he finally fought his way close enough to witness what had just happened. No, this cannot. The remaining attackers, whoever they were, used the moment of chaos to retreat swiftly into the darkness, their mission apparently already accomplished, or perhaps abandoned entirely, in the face of a power display none of them had anticipated, but no one moved to pursue them. Every eye in the clearing remained fixed on the impossible scene unfolding at its center, Alara, standing frozen with golden light still flickering faintly across her skin, Kale staring back at her with an expression of stunned, helpless wonder, and Draven standing between them, his whole body shaking with a fury and grief so profound it seemed to bend the very air around him. "Alara," Kale said quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent clearing, disbelief evident in every word. "I did not come here for this. I swear to you, I did not." "I know," Alara whispered, though she barely recognized her own voice, still reeling from the impossible weight of what had just happened. "I know you didn't plan this." Draven turned to face her, and the devastation in his eyes cut through her more sharply than any accusation could have. "The power chose him," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "After everything. After the fire, after the claim, after weeks of trying to build something real between us, your own power reached across a battlefield and chose the one man who has spent 5 years trying to destroy everything I love." His hands curled into fists at his sides, grief and fury warring visibly across his face. "Tell me this is not real, Alara. Tell me there is some other explanation." "I don't have one," Alara said, tears streaming freely down her face now, overwhelmed by the impossible collision of grief and confusion, and a bond she had never asked for, forming with a man she had only just learned was her supposed enemy. "I don't understand what just happened any better than you do." Around them, the gathered warriors and pack members stood in stunned silence, watching the impossible unfold, whispers already beginning to spread through the crowd, murmurs about ancient lineages and old legends of power that chose its own path regardless of claims or bonds forged through simple proximity. Elder Selene stepped forward slowly, her expression grim but not entirely surprised, as though some old, half-remembered piece of pack history had just clicked painfully into place. "The old stories," she murmured, mostly to herself, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The chosen bloodline. I had thought it simply legend, a tale told to explain away things no one could otherwise understand." "What stories?" Draven demanded, turning on her sharply, desperate for any explanation that might make sense of the devastation currently tearing through his chest. "Old stories," Selene said carefully, "of a bloodline whose power never bonds, according to strength, or claim, or convenience. A power that seeks balance instead, choosing whichever wolf it determines is necessary, to restore what has been broken between warring lands." Her gaze moved slowly between Draven and Kale, weighing something heavy and unspoken. "If those stories carry any truth, my king, then what happened here tonight was never a matter of choice, not for Alara, and not even fully for the power itself. It was simply fate, finally revealing the path it always intended to walk." The words offered no comfort to Draven, whose expression had crumbled into something rawer and more devastated than Alara had ever seen from him, the mask of the composed, commanding king finally, completely shattered. "I do not accept this," he said quietly, though the words carried none of their usual authority, only a desperate, broken refusal to believe what every instinct in his body was screaming to be true. "Whatever ancient magic decided this, I refuse to simply hand her over to the man who tried to burn this territory to the ground." "Draven," Alara started, reaching toward him, but he stepped back before she could touch him, the rejection cutting through her as sharply as any blade. "Do not," he said, his voice breaking on the single word. "Not tonight, I cannot." He shook his head, turning away from both of them, his shoulders rigid with barely contained grief. "Get her somewhere safe," he said to Lyra, his voice hollow. "Both of them, apparently, given what her power has just decided." He walked away without another word, disappearing into the chaos of the still smoldering clearing, and Alara stood frozen in place, staring after him, her heart shattering with a grief she had never expected to feel over a bond she had never fully chosen to accept. Even as an entirely new, equally undeniable connection burned steadily in her chest, pulling her attention helplessly toward the man standing several feet away, equally stunned, equally uncertain, and equally unprepared for the impossible turn their lives had just taken. Cale took a slow step toward her, his expression carrying none of the calculated calm she had grown accustomed to over their weeks of careful conversation, only raw, unguarded honesty. "Alara," he said quietly, "whatever happens next, I need you to know that everything I felt during our conversations by the stream was real. I did not plan for this. I did not even want it, not truly, not at the cost of what it has clearly done to you tonight." "I believe you," Alara whispered, and found, despite everything, that she genuinely did. Around them, the clearing remained hushed, warriors from both territories watching in uncertain silence as an old, powerful magic quietly rewrote the terms of a conflict that had already cost 5 years and countless lives, and neither man standing at the center of it had any clear idea yet how to navigate the impossible new reality that had just been forged, undeniably and irreversibly, in the space of a single, devastating moment. The hours following the attack passed in a strange, suspended tension, warriors from Silver Moon watching Cale with open hostility, even as their king's absence left an uncertain vacuum of authority over how exactly to handle the presence of their sworn enemy, standing quietly in the middle of their settlement. Lyra, ever practical despite her own visible shock, finally took charge, directing Cale toward a secured chamber within the longhouse, not quite a cell, but guarded closely enough to leave no doubt about the boundaries of his welcome. "I am not your prisoner," Cale said evenly, though he made no move to resist as 2 warriors flanked him toward the chamber, his gaze lingering on Alara until the corridor finally separated them from view. "You are a guest whose welcome depends entirely on how honestly you answer the questions waiting for you," Lyra replied, her tone carrying no warmth, though it was not entirely without fairness either. "Given the circumstances, I would advise patience," Cale Nightshade. "Patience, and perhaps a willingness to prove that whatever happened tonight was not simply another calculated maneuver in your long war against my king." Cale's jaw tightened, something flickering behind his dark eyes that looked, for the first time since Alara had known him, genuinely uncertain. "I did not orchestrate this," he said quietly. "I came tonight because scouts reported unusual movement near Silver Moon's borders, movement that did not match Shadowfen or Northern Territory patterns. I feared an attack from a third party I have been tracking for months. Forces I believe may be responsible for provoking conflict between myself and Draven far longer than either of us has realized." He paused, his expression darkening further. "I did not come for Alara. I came to warn Draven, however unlikely he would have been to believe a warning from me." Lyra studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity in his voice against 5 years of accumulated distrust. "We will discuss this further, once tempers have cooled," she said finally. "For now, remain here." Alara, watching from a short distance away, felt the weight of everything happening settle heavily onto her shoulders, the devastating grief of Draven's shattered expression, tangled uncomfortably with the undeniable pull she still felt toward Cale, a bond that had rewritten itself into her very blood, without asking permission from any part of her rational mind. She found Mira waiting for her in the small garden, the same quiet spot where Draven had confronted her days earlier, and sank down onto the bench beside her healer, utterly drained. "I don't understand what's happening to me," Alara whispered. "First the fire chose him. Now the power has chosen someone else entirely. I feel like I'm not even the one making decisions about my own life anymore." "Perhaps," Mira said gently, "the decisions were never entirely about romantic choice to begin with." Elder Selene spoke of balance, Alara, of a bloodline whose power exists to restore what has been broken, not simply to satisfy desire or convenience. She took Alara's hand carefully. "Whatever this bond with Cale means, it may carry a purpose far larger than either of us currently understands. That does not make Draven's pain any less real, or your own confusion any less valid, but it may mean that untangling the truth of tonight will require patience none of us fully possess yet." "He looked so devastated," Alara said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt him, Mira. Whatever else is true, I never wanted this. I know, Mira said softly. But sometimes, the truest things in life arrive wrapped in pain we never intended to cause. That does not make them any less true, however much we might wish otherwise. Meanwhile, Draven had retreated to the edge of the territory, standing alone at the top of a small rise overlooking the darkened forest. The adrenaline of battle long since faded into something heavier and far more difficult to carry. He had faced enemies before, had bled for this territory more times than he could easily count, but nothing in 5 years of war against Kael Nightshade had prepared him for the particular devastation of watching an ancient, undeniable magic choose his enemy over him in front of his entire assembled warriors. He did not know how long he stood there before Lyra found him, her approach quiet and careful, clearly uncertain how her king would receive company in the wake of such raw grief. "The chamber is secure," she said quietly. "Kael claims he came tonight to warn you about a third party responsible for the attack, not Shadowfen forces at all. He believes someone has been deliberately provoking the conflict between your territories, for reasons neither of you fully understand." Draven's laugh carried no humor in it whatsoever. "And you believe him?" "I do not know what to believe," Lyra admitted honestly. "But the attackers tonight did not wear Shadowfen colors, my king. That much was clear even in the chaos. If Kael is telling the truth, there is a third danger neither of our territories has properly accounted for, one that may have been using our war against each other as cover for its own purposes." Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark tree line, forcing himself to set aside the raw wound of Alara's bond, long enough to consider the strategic implications of what Lyra was suggesting. "If that is true," he said slowly, "then Kael and I have both been fighting the wrong war for 5 years, while whoever orchestrated this has been quietly building strength in the shadows. We were too consumed with each other to properly watch." "It would explain a great deal," Lyra said carefully. "The evidence against Kael all those years ago, evidence damning enough to force your father's counsel toward exile, evidence Kael has always insisted was fabricated. If someone else has been manipulating events between your territories from the very beginning, that old case deserves to be re-examined, however uncomfortable that reconsideration might prove." Draven closed his eyes briefly. The weight of 5 years of war, of grief, of a bond just shattered in the cruelest possible way, pressing down on him with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely uncertain of the path forward. "I need time," he admitted quietly. "Time to think, time to grieve what I lost tonight, before I can approach any of this with the clarity it deserves." "Take the time you need," Lyra said gently. "But do not take too long, my king. Whatever forces moved against Silver Moon tonight, they will not simply wait patiently while we sort through our grief and our doubts." Draven nodded slowly, though his gaze remained fixed on the dark horizon, his thoughts circling helplessly back to the image of golden light stretching across the clearing, connecting Alara to a man who was supposed to be his enemy, rewriting in a single devastating instant everything he had believed about his own future. He did not yet know how right Lyra's warning would prove to be, nor how quickly the quiet shadows gathering beyond both territories' borders would force all three of them, wounded and uncertain as they were, into an alliance none of them had ever imagined themselves capable of forming. Morning arrived heavy over Silver Moon territory, the events of the previous night settling into the pack's collective memory like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of unease spreading through every conversation, every wary glance exchanged between warriors still uncertain how to process what their own instincts had confirmed beyond any doubt. The bond between Alara and Kael was real. Whatever it meant for the fragile alliance Draven had worked so carefully to build, there was no denying the ancient magic that had rewritten itself across the battlefield, in front of dozens of witnesses. Draven called a full council at dawn, his expression carved from careful, exhausted control, the raw devastation of the previous night folded away behind the composed mask of a king who understood, even in his grief, that Silver Moon's safety could not wait for his personal wounds to heal. "The attackers wore no colors we recognize," he said, addressing the gathered elders and warriors, his voice steady, despite everything churning beneath the surface. "Kael Nightshade claims he came here not to attack, but to warn us of a third force operating in the shadows of our conflict, one that may have orchestrated tensions between our territories, for reasons neither of us yet understands." And you believe him? Elder Celine asked carefully, her sharp eyes studying Draven with the same careful assessment she gave every difficult decision. I do not know what I believe, Draven admitted honestly, a rare admission of uncertainty that rippled through the gathered council. But I know that the evidence deserves investigation, regardless of my personal feelings toward the man responsible for it. Across the chamber, seated under careful guard but no longer confined entirely to a locked room, Kale listened with an expression that carried none of his usual practiced calm. I understand your distrust, he said, addressing the room directly for the first time since his capture. 5 years of war does not simply dissolve because of a single night's revelation, but I would ask you to consider this. If I had truly orchestrated an attack on Silver Moon last night, why would I walk directly into the heart of your territory alone, without warriors, without any clear path of retreat? Perhaps arrogance, one of the elders suggested sharply. Or, perhaps a plan that failed to unfold as intended. Perhaps, Kale acknowledged evenly. Or perhaps I am telling the truth, and the real danger to both our territories has been quietly building strength, while we exhausted ourselves fighting each other over a conflict neither of us fully understands the origins of anymore. The debate stretched through the morning, tempers flaring more than once, old grievances resurfacing alongside new suspicions, and through it all, Ilara sat silently near the back of the chamber, watching the two men whose lives had become impossibly, irreversibly tangled with her own, feeling the weight of every glance that flickered uncertainly between her and each of them. It was Renwick, Kale's lieutenant, who finally arrived that afternoon, with information that shifted the entire tenor of the debate. He had ridden hard from Shadowfen territory, his expression grim as he was escorted into the council chamber under close watch. My king, he said, addressing Kale, despite the wary eyes surrounding him. We found evidence at the ruins near the western pass, tracks matching last night's attackers, along with markings I have never seen before. Not Northern Territory, not Shadowfen, not any pack symbol in our records. He produced a small carved token, dark metal etched with an unfamiliar sigil, and held it out for the room to examine. Whoever these attackers are, they have been moving through both our territories for months, disguising their movements as skirmishes between our own warriors. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the token was passed carefully from hand to hand, each examination deepening the unease settling over the gathered leaders. Draven studied the strange sigil for a long moment, something cold and calculating replacing the raw grief that had dominated his expression since the previous night. If this is accurate, he said slowly, then every border skirmish, every raid we have attributed to Shadowfen forces over the past several months, may have been the work of this third party instead, carefully staged to keep our territories locked in conflict while they operated unnoticed beneath the chaos. It would explain a great deal, Kale said quietly, his gaze meeting Draven's across the chamber with something that looked, for the first time in 5 years, less like hatred and more like grim, mutual understanding. Including, perhaps, the evidence that led to my exile in the first place. The suggestion hung heavy in the air, old wounds reopening, even as new, more urgent dangers demanded attention. Draven's jaw tightened, old certainty warring visibly with the mounting evidence in front of him. I am not prepared to simply set aside 5 years of history based on a single carved token, he said finally, though the conviction in his voice carried less certainty than it once might have. Nor am I asking you to, Kale replied evenly. I am asking you to consider that we may both have been fighting the wrong enemy, while the true threat to both our territories has been growing stronger, with every year we remain too consumed with each other to notice. Elder Celine rose slowly, her expression thoughtful, as she studied both men carefully. My king, she said, addressing Draven directly, whatever the truth of the old conflict between yourself and Kale Nightshade, the danger facing us now is immediate and undeniable. Silver Moon cannot afford to wait for old grievances to resolve themselves, while an unknown enemy continues operating freely along our borders. Draven was quiet for a long moment, the weight of leadership pressing heavily against the raw wound of personal betrayal still throbbing beneath his composed exterior. Finally, he exhaled slowly, something resigned settling into his expression. A temporary truce, he said finally, the words clearly costing him considerable effort. Until this third threat is properly understood and addressed. Nothing more. A temporary truce, Kale agreed, inclining his head slightly, though the careful watchfulness in his eyes suggested he understood exactly how fragile such an arrangement remained. The council slowly dispersed following the tense agreement, warriors from both territories exchanging wary glances as the reality of an uneasy, unprecedented alliance began settling over the gathered pack members. Alara remained in the chamber long after most had left, watching Draven gather his maps and reports with the same careful, controlled efficiency he brought to every crisis, even as she could see the exhaustion and grief still simmering just beneath the surface. "Draven," she said quietly, approaching him carefully. He looked up, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded flickered across his expression, before he carefully masked it once more. "Ilara, I know this isn't what either of us wanted," she said. "But I need you to know that whatever the power decided last night, it does not erase everything real that existed between us these past weeks." "Doesn't it?" Draven asked quietly, his voice carrying more exhaustion than anger now. "I claimed you as my mate, Ilara. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that meant something permanent. Now I am asked to work alongside the very man my own instincts recognize as a rival for your heart, all while pretending my chest does not feel like it has been torn open." He shook his head slowly. "I will honor the truce, because Silver Moon's safety requires it. But do not ask me to pretend that watching you bonded to Kale Nightshade does not cost me something I am not certain I know how to recover from." The honesty in his voice, stripped of its usual careful control, hurt more than anger would have. Ilara reached toward him instinctively, and this time, though he tensed, he did not step away entirely, allowing her hand to rest briefly against his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for all of it. For the secrecy, for the pain, for a bond neither of us chose, but both of us now have to carry." Draven's expression softened, just slightly, old tenderness bleeding through the careful walls he had built since the previous night. "I do not blame you, Ilara," he said quietly. "Not truly. I blame the fate that decided to make our story this complicated." He stepped back gently, putting careful distance between them once more. "But I need time to grieve what I believed we were building, before I can figure out what, if anything, remains possible between us now." She nodded, understanding, though the ache in her chest did not lessen with the acknowledgement. As she watched him leave the chamber, she found herself caught, as she had been every day since the fire, between two men whose fates had become impossibly tangled with her own, one bound to her by claim and growing affection, the other bound to her by ancient, undeniable magic neither of them had asked for, and beyond both of them, a shadow enemy, patiently waiting in the dark for the fragile new alliance to shatter, before it had even fully formed. That evening, Kale found himself the subject of far more scrutiny than he had anticipated, even from his own warriors, who had ridden hard from Shadowfen territory, once word of the truce reached them, uncertain, and visibly uneasy about an alliance with the very territory they had spent 5 years fighting against. "You are certain about this," Renwick said quietly, finding Kale alone near the edge of the training grounds, watching the Silver Moon warriors drill in the fading evening light, with the same wary distance every Shadowfen soldier currently maintained. A truce with Draven Ashford, after everything. "I am certain the third-party threat is real," Kale said carefully. "Whether I am equally certain about everything else remains considerably more complicated." Renwick studied him for a long moment, old loyalty warring with visible concern. "The bond with the girl," he said finally. "It has changed things for you. More than strategy ever could have." "Yes," Kale admitted, the honesty costing him more than he expected. "I did not plan for this, Renwick. I built a careful strategy, meant to give Ilara a genuine choice, meant to weaken Draven's certainty in a bond he had claimed without her consent. I never intended for the power itself to choose me instead." He shook his head slowly, something almost bewildered in his expression. "I do not know how to navigate what has happened, both for our territory's sake and for my own heart, which I foolishly believed had grown too guarded for this kind of complication." "And the exile?" Renwick asked carefully. "The evidence at the Western Pass, suggesting the same forces responsible for last night's attack, may have been behind the crime that led to your banishment in the first place." Kale's expression darkened, old pain resurfacing beneath the weight of new possibility. "If that proves true," he said quietly, then I have spent 5 years hating a man for a betrayal that may never have truly been his doing. 5 years building an army, and a war around a lie neither of us fully understood. He exhaled slowly. I do not know yet whether I am prepared to forgive that possibility, Renwick. But I understand now that I owe it to myself, and perhaps to Draven as well, to properly investigate the truth before continuing to build my entire identity around vengeance for a crime that may have been orchestrated by someone else entirely. Meanwhile, within the settlement, Elara found herself unable to settle into any kind of peace, the weight of the day's revelations pressing heavily against her chest as she wandered the quiet paths near the longhouse, unable to fully process everything that had unfolded in the span of a single devastating night. She had gained a bond she never asked for, wounded a man who had shown her genuine care despite his own complicated claim upon her, and now found herself standing at the center of a fragile truce between two territories that had spent 5 years locked in bitter war. She did not know, not yet, exactly what her own power truly was, where it had come from, or why it had chosen the path it had chosen. But she understood, with growing certainty, that the answers to those questions had become more urgent than ever, both for her own sake and for the fragile peace, now depending on understanding exactly what ancient magic had decided to rewrite the terms of an old and bitter conflict. She found Mira later that evening, poring over old texts by lantern light in the small healing hut, and settled beside her, exhausted but resolute. I need to know where I come from, Elara said quietly. My mother's bloodline, whatever legacy she was running from. I cannot keep stumbling through decisions this important without understanding what I actually am. Mira looked up, something quietly proud flickering behind her tired eyes. Then we will find out together, she said. Whatever it takes. Outside, beyond the walls of the settlement, the night stretched on, quiet and watchful, carrying within its shadows the patient, calculating presence of an enemy neither territory had yet fully understood, one that had spent months, perhaps years, carefully orchestrating a war meant to keep both Draven and Kale too consumed with each other, to notice the far greater danger, quietly gathering strength in the spaces between their conflict, waiting for the precise moment to reveal itself fully, and claim whatever prize it had been patiently working toward all along. The following days folded into a careful, determined search for answers, Elara and Mira poring over every old text Silvermoon's small archive contained, while Lyra reached out through careful, discreet channels to older packs across the northern territories, asking after any surviving knowledge of bloodlines tied to power that answered to balance rather than strength or claim. Progress came slowly, fragments of half-remembered legend scattered across generations of oral history, until finally, nearly a week later, a breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. An elderly historian from a distant eastern pack, contacted through one of Lyra's old contacts, sent word that she possessed records dating back centuries, detailing a lineage the old texts called simply the Anchored, women and men born with a power, tied not to any single pack's bloodline, but to the land itself, activated only in times when warring territories teetered on the edge of destruction. According to the fragmented records, an Anchored's power always sought the same purpose, identifying whichever combination of leaders held the truest capacity to restore balance between fractured lands, and binding itself to that path regardless of personal desire, politics, or existing claims. It is not about love, not directly, the historian explained through a lengthy letter Lyra read aloud to the assembled group. Elara, Mira, Draven, and Kale, all gathered together in the council chamber, despite the lingering tension between them. Though love may certainly grow from the bond once formed, the power itself responds to necessity. It chooses the path most likely to prevent catastrophic conflict, weaving itself into whichever combination of leadership can achieve genuine, lasting balance. Then the bond with Kale, Draven said slowly, something complicated shifting behind his carefully controlled expression, was never truly about replacing what existed between Elara and myself. It was about something larger. Balance between our two territories. It appears so, the letter continued, Lyra reading carefully. Historical accounts suggest that in every recorded instance, the Anchored's power activated most powerfully, not toward a single mate, but toward whatever configuration of bonds was necessary to end conflict and restore stability to lands teetering on the edge of ruin. In several recorded cases, The Anchored formed connections with more than one leader simultaneously, when circumstances required an alliance stronger than any single bond could provide. The revelation settled over the room with heavy, complicated implications. Ilara felt her heart pounding as she processed the weight of what the historian's letter suggested, a lineage that existed not for her own personal fulfillment, but as some ancient, living mechanism meant to hold entire territories together during their most dangerous moments. "My mother," Ilara said quietly, the pieces slowly falling into place. "She must have known what I was, what I would eventually become responsible for. That's why she fled, why she hid, why she warned me my whole life to bury this power, rather than let it surface." "She may have been trying to protect you from exactly this," Mira said gently, understanding dawning in her own expression as well. "From a destiny that asks you to carry the weight of entire territories' survival on your shoulders, rather than allowing you the simple, ordinary life she perhaps hoped you might have instead." The weight of the revelation pressed heavily on everyone gathered in the chamber, but it was Kale who finally broke the silence, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implications carefully. "If this is accurate," he said slowly, "then the true threat facing us, whoever orchestrated the attack and the false evidence behind my exile, may have understood this ancient lineage far better than either Draven or I ever did. They may have been working for years specifically to prevent an anchored bond from ever forming between our territories, precisely because such a bond would threaten whatever advantage they have been quietly building from our continued conflict." "That would explain the timing," Draven said, his strategic mind engaging, despite the personal weight of everything else unfolding around them. "If Ilara's power had remained hidden, if she had never manifested, our territories would have continued their war indefinitely, weakening both sides, while this third force grew stronger unnoticed. The attack on the night she first manifested her power in the forest, the attempted assassination during the recent battle, all of it may have been aimed at eliminating her before her power could ever fully activate. Which means," Kale added grimly, "that whoever we are truly facing understood the danger she represented to their plans long before either of us did." The realization sent a chill through the assembled group, the puzzle pieces of the past several weeks finally arranging themselves into a far more coherent and far more alarming picture than any of them had previously understood. Ilara sat quietly amid the unfolding discussion, processing the enormity of what her own existence apparently represented. Not simply a woman caught between two powerful men, but a living key to preventing catastrophic conflict across an entire region, one that some unknown enemy had been working desperately to eliminate before it could ever fully awaken. "I don't know how to carry this," she admitted quietly, drawing the attention of the room. "An entire lineage's purpose, resting on choices I never even knew I was capable of making. How am I supposed to trust any of this, when I still barely understand my own power, let alone the weight it apparently carries for everyone around me?" Draven's expression softened, old tenderness breaking through the careful distance he had maintained since the night of the bond's formation. "You do not have to carry it alone," he said quietly, surprising her with the gentleness in his voice despite everything that had happened between them. "Whatever this power requires of you, Ilara, you are not simply a vessel for some ancient purpose. You are still the woman who ran through a burning forest and chose to protect a stranger rather than save herself first. That choice matters, regardless of what old legends and prophecies suggest about your destiny." Kale nodded in quiet agreement, something unexpectedly aligned passing between the two men who had spent 5 years as bitter enemies. "He is right," Kale said. "Whatever the power decided, whatever purpose it serves, the choices you make from here forward remain your own, Ilara. No legend, however ancient, can claim ownership over your heart or your will." The unexpected unity between Draven and Kale, however fragile, offered Ilara a small measure of comfort amid the overwhelming weight of everything she had just learned. She looked between the two men, both bound to her now in ways neither of them had chosen, both apparently willing to set aside their own personal grievances long enough to help her navigate the impossible path ahead, and felt something shift quietly in her chest. Not quite resolution, but perhaps the beginning of it. "We still don't know who is truly behind all of this," Lyra said, bringing the conversation back to the immediate danger still facing them. "The sigil Renwick found, the false evidence behind Kale's exile, the coordinated attacks designed to keep our territories at war. Whoever orchestrated all of this remains hidden, and if they understand the danger Alara's power represents to their plans, they will not simply retreat now that the anchored bond has already begun forming. Then we prepare, Draven said, his voice firming with renewed purpose, despite the personal complications still tangled beneath the surface. Fully. Both territories combined, every resource we can spare, focused on uncovering who has been manipulating us for years, before they have the chance to strike again, with even greater force. Kale inclined his head in agreement. Shadowfen's warriors, however small our numbers compared to the northern territories, stand ready to contribute whatever is needed. The council that followed stretched long into the night, maps spread across every available surface, warriors from both territories working alongside each other for the first time in years, tension slowly giving way to grudging, necessary cooperation, as the shape of a genuine alliance began forming, not simply because ancient magic demanded it, but because the mounting evidence left no reasonable alternative. Alara watched it all unfold with a quiet, growing sense of purpose settling over the exhaustion and confusion that had dominated her days since the fire first changed everything. She did not yet know exactly how her power would ultimately be tested, or what final sacrifice the coming conflict might demand of her, but for the first time since discovering the truth of her lineage, she felt something steadier taking root beneath the fear, a growing understanding that whatever destiny had chosen for her, she still retained the power to shape how she carried it forward. Later that night, after the council had finally dispersed, and the settlement had settled into an uneasy, watchful quiet, Alara found herself standing once more in the small garden behind the longhouse, staring up at the same moon that had witnessed every impossible turn her life had taken since the night her home first burned to the ground. She did not hear him approach until he was standing beside her, and she was surprised to find it was not Kale, but Draven, his expression carrying a quiet, complicated peace she had not seen from him since before the truth of Kale's identity had first shattered the fragile trust between them. "I have spent the past several days angry," he admitted quietly, staring up at the same moon rather than meeting her eyes directly. Angry at fate, at Kale, at myself for not seeing the danger sooner. But tonight, hearing what the power truly represents, I find myself grieving something different now. Not the loss of a claim I believed was mine alone, but the realization that perhaps it was never meant to be simple in the first place. "Draven," Alara started, uncertain what to say, but he shook his head gently, silencing her with a small, tired smile. "I do not need you to fix this for me tonight," he said. "I only wanted you to know that whatever shape our future takes, whatever balance your power ultimately decides is necessary, I do not regret the weeks we shared before everything became this complicated. That, at least, remains true, regardless of everything else." Alara felt tears sting her eyes at the quiet honesty in his words, grief and gratitude tangling together in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding, even when I know how much this has cost you." Draven nodded slowly, and for a long moment, they simply stood together beneath the moonlight, two people whose paths had collided in fire and chaos, now facing an uncertain future neither of them had chosen, but both of them, in their own complicated ways, had begun learning to accept. 2 days later, a breakthrough finally arrived, delivered by one of Kale's scouts who had spent the preceding week tracking the strange sigil markings back toward their source. The scout returned exhausted but triumphant, bearing news that shifted the entire investigation into sharp, urgent focus. "The markings belong to a territory east of the mountain range," the scout reported, addressing the combined council of both territories with careful precision. "A pack called Ravenhollow, led by an alpha named Corwin Blackthorn. They have remained isolated for decades, rarely engaging with neighboring territories, which is precisely why no one suspected them of orchestrating conflict this far from their own borders." "What would Ravenhollow gain from a war between our territories?" Draven asked, frowning as he studied the map spread before them, tracing the distant boundary of the pack in question. "Land," Kale said grimly, understanding dawning across his features as the pieces clicked into place. "If Silver Moon and the Northern Territories exhausted themselves in prolonged conflict, weakened enough that neither could properly defend contested borderlands, Ravenhollow would be perfectly positioned to expand into the resulting vacuum, claiming territory that has remained fiercely protected by both our packs for generations." "And the evidence against you," Draven said slowly, turning to face Kale directly. "5 years ago." If Corwin Blackthorn orchestrated that as well, staging the crime that led to your exile specifically to weaken the Northern Territories by removing a strong potential heir and igniting war with Shadowfen simultaneously, then everything, Kale finished quietly, the exile, the war, 5 years of bloodshed between our territories, may have been engineered from the very beginning by a pack neither of us ever considered a genuine threat. The revelation settled over the chamber with heavy, sobering weight. Old grievances suddenly recontextualized within a far larger and more calculated scheme than either territory had previously understood. Alara watched the two men she was now bonded to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed, watched 5 years of bitter hatred begin, slowly and painfully, to reshape itself into something closer to shared grief over a manipulation neither of them had seen coming. "We need proof," Elder Celine said practically, cutting through the heavy silence. "Suspicion alone will not undo 5 years of history, nor will it convince either territory's remaining skeptics to fully commit to this alliance." "Then we obtain proof," Draven said, resolve hardening his expression. "A small scouting party, moving quietly toward Ravenhollow's borders, gathering whatever evidence we can before deciding how to proceed." "I will lead it myself," Kale said immediately. "If Corwin Blackthorn is responsible for my exile, I intend to see the truth uncovered personally, regardless of the risk involved." "You will not go alone," Draven said, the words surprising everyone in the chamber, including, visibly, Kale himself. "Whatever remains unresolved between us, I will not send you into potential danger without proper support, not when the truth you seek may finally clear a debt this territory owes you for 5 years of unjust exile." The offer hung in the air, heavy with implications neither man seemed entirely prepared to fully articulate. An old enmity slowly, cautiously giving way to something that might, with enough time and effort, eventually resemble genuine respect. "I want to come as well," Alara said suddenly, drawing surprised glances from around the chamber. "Absolutely not," Draven said immediately, protective instinct flaring sharply. "If Ravenhollow understands what your power represents, walking directly toward their territory would be an unnecessary and catastrophic risk." "My power is the reason any of this matters," Alara countered firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "If Corwin Blackthorn has been working to prevent an anchored bond from forming, he will not simply retreat because I remain safely behind Silvermoon's walls. I would rather face this directly, with both of you beside me, than wait helplessly for the next attack to find me regardless." Kale studied her carefully, something like reluctant respect flickering behind his dark eyes. "She is not wrong," he said quietly, though the words clearly cost him some effort, given his own protective instincts. "And her power may prove essential if Ravenhollow chooses to confront us directly rather than simply allowing us to gather evidence quietly." Draven's jaw tightened, torn visibly between his desperate need to protect her and the practical recognition that her argument carried genuine merit. Finally, he exhaled slowly, defeat evident in the set of his shoulders. "If you come," he said, "you remain close to one of us at all times. No exceptions." "Agreed," Alara said, relief evident in her expression, despite the gravity of what they were preparing to undertake. The following days passed in careful, urgent preparation. Warriors from both territories selected for the small scouting party, provisions gathered, routes toward Ravenhollow's distant borders mapped and studied with meticulous care. Alara spent the evenings practicing with Lyra, pushing herself to better understand and control the power that had already reshaped her entire life twice over. Determined to ensure that if her abilities were needed during the coming confrontation, she would meet the moment with something closer to command, rather than the desperate, uncontrolled bursts that had defined every previous manifestation. "You're improving quickly," Lyra observed one evening, watching Alara successfully summon a small, controlled pulse of golden light, without the overwhelming flood that had characterized her earlier attempts. "Whatever this power ultimately is, it seems to respond well to confidence rather than fear." "I'm tired of being afraid of it," Alara admitted, studying her own glowing palm with something closer to acceptance than dread. "For years, I saw it as a curse, something to hide and suppress. But if it truly exists to protect balance, to prevent catastrophic conflict, then perhaps it deserves to be understood rather than feared, even by the person carrying it." Lyra smiled, something warm and proud in her expression. That sounds like wisdom hard won, Alara. Your mother would be proud, I imagine, to see how far you've come from the frightened girl who once buried this gift out of fear alone. The words settled comfortingly in Alara's chest as she continued practicing late into the evening, the golden light responding more readily now to her deliberate intention, no longer simply an involuntary reaction to fear, but something she was slowly, carefully learning to call upon with purpose. On the eve of their departure toward Raven Hollow's distant borders, Alara found herself standing once more beneath the night sky, this time flanked by both Draven and Kale. The three of them gathered together in quiet, uneasy solidarity, as they prepared to face whatever truth and whatever danger awaited them at the source of the conflict that had shaped all their lives for the past 5 years. Whatever happens tomorrow, Draven said quietly, breaking the contemplative silence between them, I want you both to know that regardless of old grievances, I do not intend to let Corwin Blackthorn continue manipulating our territories unchecked. Silver Moon, the Northern Territories, and yes, Shadowfen as well, deserve better than 5 years of manufactured war. Kale nodded slowly, something like genuine solidarity settling into his expression, for the first time since this impossible alliance had first begun forming. Agreed, he said simply. Whatever else remains unresolved between us, on this, at least, we stand united. Alara looked between the two men, feeling the weight of the bond, connecting all three of them settle into something steadier than the confusion and grief that had defined the past several weeks. Whatever the coming days held, whatever danger awaited them at Raven Hollow's borders, she understood now, with growing clarity, that she did not face it alone, and that the ancient power running through her blood had, perhaps, chosen exactly the right allies to help her navigate the impossible path still stretching ahead. The journey toward Raven Hollow's distant borders took 3 days, the small scouting party moving carefully through unfamiliar terrain, mountains rising sharp and gray against the horizon, as they left the familiar forests of Silver Moon and the Northern Territories behind. Alara rode between Draven and Kale for most of the journey, the strange, complicated dynamic between the three of them, slowly settling into something workable, if not entirely comfortable, born from necessity and the shared purpose now driving them all forward. They reached the outer edge of Raven Hollow territory on the evening of the 3rd day, and Renwick, scouting ahead with careful stealth, returned with grim confirmation of everything they had feared. Warriors bearing the same sigil found on the attacker's token patrolled the borders in disciplined formations, far more heavily armed than a supposedly isolated, peaceful pack should reasonably require. They're preparing for something, Renwick reported quietly. Supply stores larger than their population could possibly need. Weapons stockpiled beyond anything defensive. Whatever Corwin Blackthorn has been planning, it extends well beyond simply provoking conflict between Silver Moon and the Northern Territories. Draven's expression hardened as he studied the distant torchlight marking Raven Hollow's central settlement. We need to reach Corwin directly, he said. Confrontation, not simply evidence gathering. If he has been preparing for expansion this extensively, waiting any longer risks giving him the opportunity to strike first. Agreed, Kale said, but we cannot simply storm his territory with a scouting party this small. We need him to reveal himself, ideally in front of witnesses who cannot easily be dismissed or silenced afterward. It was Alara who finally suggested the plan that would ultimately unfold, born from the growing confidence she had cultivated in her own power over the preceding weeks. Let me draw him out, she said, drawing surprised looks from everyone gathered. If he understands what my power represents, if he has spent years trying to prevent an anchored bond from forming, my presence alone should be enough to bring him out of hiding, rather than risk allowing us to gather more evidence undisturbed. Absolutely not, Draven said immediately, old protective instinct flaring sharp and immediate. That is far too dangerous. It is also likely the only approach that will work, Alara countered steadily. Corwin has spent years operating carefully, from the shadows, never directly confronting either of your territories. The only thing that would draw him into the open is a threat significant enough that hiding is no longer a viable option. My power, fully revealed, would be exactly that threat. Kale studied her carefully, weighing the risk against the necessity, old strategic instincts warring visibly with newer, more personal concern for her safety. If we position warriors carefully, out of sight, but close enough to respond quickly, he said slowly, The plan has merit. But I share Draven's hesitation, Elara. This carries genuine risk. I understand the risk, Elara said firmly. But I am tired of being someone others fight to protect from the shadows. Let me be someone who helps end this, directly, rather than simply hiding until the danger finds me regardless. After considerable tense debate, the plan was finally agreed upon. Warriors positioned carefully around the perimeter of a small clearing near Ravenhollow's border, close enough to respond swiftly, hidden well enough to remain undetected until needed. Elara walked into the open clearing alone, her heart pounding, but her resolve steady, and allowed her power to build slowly within her chest, golden light beginning to glow softly beneath her skin, visible even in the fading evening light. It did not take long for Ravenhollow's warriors to notice. Within minutes, a contingent of armed wolves emerged from the tree line, and behind them, walking with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had spent years believing himself untouchable, came Corwin Blackthorn himself, an older man with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes that studied Elara with open, unmasked interest. "So," Corwin said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing, "the anchored finally reveals herself. I confess, I did not expect you to walk directly into my territory quite so boldly. You've spent years manipulating 2 territories into war," Elara said, keeping her voice steady, despite the fear pounding through her chest. "Staging attacks, fabricating evidence, all to keep them weak enough for Ravenhollow to expand unchecked." Corwin's expression carried no denial, only a thin, cold smile. "Clever girl, though knowledge without power to act on it accomplishes little." He gestured, and his warriors shifted forward slightly, a clear, unmistakable threat. "I had hoped to eliminate you before your power ever fully manifested. It seems fate had other plans." "Fate," Draven's voice cut across the clearing as he emerged from the tree line, Kale and their combined warriors moving into position alongside him, along with rather thorough evidence gathering, apparently. Corwin's expression flickered with genuine surprise, quickly masked, as he took in the sight of Draven and Kale standing together, warriors from both the Northern Territories and Shadowfen positioned in unified formation around the clearing. "An alliance," he said slowly, something calculating shifting behind his eyes. "How inconvenient." 5 years of manufactured war, Kale said, stepping forward, his voice carrying barely controlled fury. 5 years of bloodshed between territories that should have been allies from the beginning, all orchestrated by a pack too cowardly to face either of us directly. "Cowardly," Corwin repeated, something sharp and dangerous entering his voice for the first time. "Or simply patient. Ravenhollow has watched both your territories squander resources, and lives on a conflict that served my purposes perfectly. I saw no reason to risk direct confrontation when manipulation accomplished the same goal, with far less cost, to my own forces." "That ends today," Draven said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as king. "You will answer for the exile forced upon Kale Nightshade, through fabricated evidence, for the attacks against Silver Moon, and for every life lost in a war you orchestrated for territorial gain." Corwin's calm finally cracked, fury replacing calculation, as he realized the extent of what had been uncovered. "You think evidence and accusations will simply undo everything I have built?" he snarled, gesturing sharply toward his warriors. "Ravenhollow will not surrender territory we have spent years preparing to claim." The confrontation erupted swiftly, Ravenhollow's warriors surging forward, even as Draven and Kale's combined forces moved to meet them, the clearing dissolving into chaos as steel met steel, and the careful plan gave way to desperate, urgent battle. Elara felt fear surge through her chest, and with it, her power answered, golden light bursting outward in controlled, deliberate waves, rather than the chaotic overflow of her earlier manifestations, disarming warriors, without lethal force, creating barriers that separated combatants and gave Draven's and Kale's forces the advantage they needed. Corwin, watching his careful plans unravel before his eyes, turned and fled toward the deeper forest, but Draven was faster, cutting off his escape with brutal, efficient speed, while Kale moved to secure the remaining warriors, their combined forces quickly overwhelming Ravenhollow's diminished numbers, now that the element of surprise had been lost entirely. "It's over, Corwin," Draven said, standing over the fallen Alpha, his blade steady, despite the exhaustion of battle evident in his heaving breath. Whatever you hope to gain, it ends here. Corwin, defeated, and finally without any further strategy to fall back on, said nothing, his silence carrying its own bitter admission of guilt. In the aftermath, as warriors from both territories worked to secure Ravenhollow's remaining forces and tend to the wounded, Ilara found herself standing between Draven and Kael once more, the golden light finally fading from her skin as exhaustion settled over her, deep but satisfied in a way she had never experienced before. "You were remarkable," Kael said quietly, studying her with open admiration. "We were remarkable," Ilara corrected gently. "All three of us, together." Draven's expression softened as he looked at her, old grief finally settling into something closer to peace. "The evidence Corwin's forces carry should be more than sufficient to clear your name fully," he said, turning to Kael. 5 years of exile, ended by truth rather than continued war. Kael inclined his head, something profoundly grateful passing behind his dark eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing enough in that possibility to fight alongside me for it." In the weeks that followed, as Ravenhollow's remaining forces were brought to account, and the truth of Corwin's manipulation spread across both territories, the fragile alliance between Silver Moon, the Northern Territories, and Shadowfen slowly solidified into something genuine and lasting. Kael's exile was formally overturned, his name cleared before the full council of the Northern Territories, and slowly, carefully, the deep wounds of 5 years of unnecessary war began the long, patient process of healing. Draven, for his part, found a peace he had not expected to discover in the aftermath of losing his claim on Ilara so completely. Watching her stand steady and confident between himself and Kael, watching the genuine bond she now shared with both of them settle into something that honored the ancient purpose of her lineage, rather than fighting against it, he found himself letting go of the possessive grief that had defined his earliest days after the bond's formation, choosing instead to embrace whatever new balance their unusual, unprecedented connection had created. "I once told you that you were mine," he said to her one evening, months later, as the three of them stood together, overlooking the newly rebuilt borders between their territories, watching warriors from all three packs patrol side by side, in genuine cooperation, for the first time in living memory. "I understand now that I was wrong. You were never meant to belong to any single person, Ilara. You were meant to belong to the balance you helped protect, and I am grateful, more than I can properly express, to remain part of that balance alongside you." Ilara smiled, reaching for his hand on one side and Kael's on the other, feeling the steady warmth of the ancient power finally settled and at peace within her chest, no longer a burden to hide or fear, but a gift she had learned, slowly and painfully, to fully embrace. "We built this together," she said softly, looking out over the territories now bound in unprecedented peace. "All of us. That has to count for something lasting." Behind them, the sun set slowly over lands that had known 5 years of unnecessary war, now standing united under a new understanding, forged not through force or claim, but through truth, sacrifice, and the ancient, unbreakable power of choice finally allowed to unfold, exactly as it always should have. The story of the anchored, once buried in forgotten legend, had finally found its place again in living memory, and the balance she restored would carry forward for generations, a testament to the idea that even the most bitter conflicts could be healed, when those willing to fight for peace proved brave enough to choose truth over vengeance, and unity over pride.